Chapter 54 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There and Back by George MacDonald, Chapter 54, Barbara at Home. Barbara's brother, her father's twin, was fast following her mother's to that somewhere each of us must learn for himself. No one can learn from another. While they were in London, he was in the Isle of Wight with his tutor. His mother and sister had several times gone to see him, but he did not show much pleasure in their attentions, and was certainly happier with his tutor than with anyone else. Disease, however, was making straight the path of love. Now they were all at home at Wilder Hall, and Death was on his way to join them. Love, however, was watching, ready to wrest from him his sting, without which he is no more death, but sleep. As the poor fellow grew weaker, his tutor became less able to console him, and he could not look to his mother for the tenderness he had seen her lavish on his brother. But the love of his sister had always leaned toward him, ready, on the least opening of the door of his heart, to show itself in the chink. And at last the opportunity of being to him and doing for him what she could arrived. One day on the lawn he tripped and fell. The strong little Barbara took him in her arms and carried him to his room. When two drops of water touch, the mere contact is not of long duration. The hearts of the sister and the dying brother rushed into each other. After this, they were seldom apart. A new life had waked in the very heart of death, and grew and spread through the being of the boy. His eye became brighter, not with fever only, but with love and content and hope. For Barbara made him feel that nothing could part them, that they had been born into the world for the hour when they should find one another, as now they had found one another, to have one another to all eternity. It was an end of their being. He would come creeping up to her as she worked or read, and sit on a stool at her feet, asking for nothing, wishing for nothing, content to be near her. But then Barbara's book or work was soon banished. He was bigger than she, but the muscles of the little maiden were as springs of steel, informed with the tenderest, strongest heart in all the county, and presently he would find himself lifted to her lap, his head on her shoulder, the sweetest voice in all the world whispering loveliest secrets in his willing ear, and her face bent over him with the stoop of heaven over the patient, weary earth. In her arms his poor wasting body forgot its restlessness. The fever that irritated every nerve, burning away the dust of the world, seemed to pause and let him grow a little cool, and the sleep that sometimes came to him there was sweet as death. The face that had so long looked peevish wore now a waiting look. In heaven everyone sheltered the other, and the arms of God were round them all. One day the mother peeped in and saw them seated thus. Motherhood, strong in her, though hitherto, as regarded the boy, poisoned by her strife with her husband, moved and woke at the sight of her natural place occupied by her daughter. "Let me take him, poor fellow," she said. Delighted that her mother should do something for him, Barbara rose with him in her arms. The mother sat down, and Barbara laid him in her lap. But the mother felt him lie listless and dead. No arm came creeping feebly up to encircle her neck. One of her babies died unborn, and she knew the moment the strange, sad feeling of the time came back to her now. She felt through all her sensitive maternal body that her child did not care for her. Grown through her late illness, at once weaker and tenderer, she burst into silent weeping. He looked up. The convulsion of her pain had roused him from a half-sleep. A tear dropped on his face. "Don't rain, Mamma. I will be good," he said, and held his mouth to be kissed. He was much too old for such baby speech, but as he grew weaker, he had grown younger, and it seemed now as if, in his utter helplessness, he would go back to the bosom of his mother. She clasped him to her, and from that moment she and Barbara shared him between them. So for a while Barbara had not the same room to think about Richard, but when she did think of him, it was always in the some loving, trusting, hoping way. When in London, she went to all the parties to which she was expected to go, and enjoyed them after her own fashion. She loved her kind and liked their company up to a point, But often would the crowd and the glitter, the motion and iridescence vanish from her, and she sit there a live soul dreaming within closed doors. She would be pacing her weary pony through a pale land under a globose moon, homeward, or on the back of one of her father's fleet horses, sweeping eastward over the grassy land, in the level light of the setting sun, watching the strange herald shadow of herself and her horse rushing away before them, ever more distort as it fled. Like some ghastly monster in horror at itself, it hurried to the infinite, seeking blessed annihilation, and ever gathering speed as the sun of its being sank, till at last it gained the goal of its nirvana, not by its well-run race, but in the darkness of its vanished creator. Then with a sigh would Barbara come to herself, the center of many regards. Arthur Lestrange found himself no nearer to her than before, farther off indeed, for here he was but one among many that sought her. But her behavior to him was the same in a crowded room in London as in the garden at Montstrange. She spoke to him kindly, turned friendly to him when he addressed her, and behaved so that the lying hint of Lady Anne that they had been for some time engaged was easily believed. A certain self-satisfied, well-dressed idiot said it was a pity a girl like that, a little Amazon, who, for as innocent as she looked, could ride backward and steer her steed straight, should marry a half-baked brick like Lestrange. Arthur, though he was not one of the worthiest, was worth 10 of him, faultless as were his coats and neckties. Her father had several times said to her that it was time she should marry, but had never got near anything definite, for there her eyes would flash and her mouth close tight, compelling the reflection that her mother had been more than enough for him, and he had better not throw his daughter into the opposition as well. He could not, he saw clearly, prevail with her against her liking, but it would be an infernal pity, he thought, seeing poor Marcus must go, if she would not have Lestrange, for the properties would marry splendidly, and then who could tell what better title might not stand on top of the baronetcy? Lady Anne would not let her hope go. She grew daily more fearful of the cloud that hung in the future. Out of it might at any moment step the child of her enemy, the low-born woman that had dared to be Lady Lestrange before her. Then where would she and her children be? That her Arthur would not succeed him would be a morsel to sweeten her husband's death for him. It would be life and death to him to spite the woman he had married. At one crisis in their history he had placed in her hands a will that left everything to her son, but he might have made 10 wills after that one. She knew she had done nothing to please him. She had, in fact, never spent a thought on making life a good thing to the man she had married. She wished she had endeavored, or might now endeavor, to make herself agreeable to him, but it was too late. Sir Wilton would instantly imagine a rumor of the lost heir, and be on the alert for her discomfiture. If only he had not yet made a later will. He must die some day. Why not in time to make his death of use when his life was of none? No one would wonder he had preferred the offspring of her noble person to the lost brat of the peasant woman. How far over the line that separates guilt from greed, Lady Anne might not have gone had she been sure of not being found out. She herself could not have told. The look of things is very different at night and in the morning. The bedchamber can shelter what would be a horror in a court of justice. A conscience at peace in its own darkness will shudder in the gaslight of public opinion. It is marvelous that what we call the public, a mere imbecile as to judgment, should yet possess the godlike power of awakening the individual conscience, and that with its own large dullness of conscience. Truly, the relation of the world to its maker cannot primarily be an intellectual one. It must be a relation tremendously deeper. We do not, I mean, to speak after the manner of men, come of God's intellect, but of his imagination. He did not make us with his hands, but loved us out of his heart. The same week in which Sir Wilton gave that will into his lady's keeping, he executed a second, in which he made the virtue of the former depend on the non-appearance of the lost heir. Of this will he said nothing to his wife. Even from the grave he would hold a shadowy, yet not impotent rod over her and her family. Lady Anne suspected something of the sort, and spent every moment safe from his possible appearance in searching for some such hidden torpedo. But there was one thing of which Sir Wilton took better care than of his honor, and that was his bunch of keys. After the return of the Lestranges and the Wilders to their country homes, Lady Anne, having prevailed on Mrs. Wilder to pay her a visit, initiated an attempt to gain her connivance in her project for the alliance of the houses. For this purpose she opened upon her with the same artillery she had employed against her husband. Mrs. Wilder sat for some time quietly listening, but looking so like her daughter that Lady Anne saw the mother's and not the father's was the alliance to seek. Thereupon she plucked the Tommian out of the best gun in her battery, as she thought, and began to hint a fear that Miss Wilder had taken a fancy to a person unworthy of her. "Girls who have not been much in society," she said, "are not unfrequently the sport of strange infatuations. I have myself known an earl's daughter marry a baker. I do not, of course, imagine your daughter guilty of the slightest impropriety." Scarcely had the word left her lips when a fury stood before her, towered above her, eyes flashing and mouth set as if on the point of tearing her to pieces. "Say the word and my Bab in the same breath again, and I'll throttle you, you vile woman," cried Mrs. Wilder, and hung there like a thundercloud, lightning continuously. Lady Anne was not of a breed familiar with fear, but for the first time in her life, except in the presence of her mother, a far more formidable person than herself, she did feel afraid of what she would have found it hard to say, for to acknowledge the possibility of personal violence would be almost as undignified as to threaten it. "I did not mean to offend you," she said, growing a little paler, but at the same time more rigid. "What sort of mother do you take me for? Offended, indeed! Would you be all honey, I should like to know, if I had the assurance to say such a thing of one of your girls?" "I spoke as to a mother who knew what girls are like." "You don't know what my girl Bab is like," cried Mrs. Wilder, with something that much resembled an imprecation. The word she used would shock thousands of mothers not comparable to her in motherhood. If propriety were righteousness, the kingdom of heaven would be already populous. Lady Anne was offended, and seriously. Was alliance with such a woman permissible or sufferable? But she was silent. For once in her life she did not know the proper thing to say. Was the woman mad, or only a savage? Mrs. Wilder's eloquence required opposition. She turned away, and with a backward glance of blazing wrath left the room and the house. "Home like the devil," she said to the footman as he closed the door of the carriage, and she disappeared in a whirlwind. From the library, Sir Wilton saw her stormy exit and departure. "By Jove," he said to himself, "that woman must be one of the right sort. She's what my Ruby might have been by this time if she'd been spared. 100 to 1 my lady was insolent to her, said something cool about her madcap girl probably. She's the right sort, by Jove, that little Bab. If only my Richard now, leathery fellow, would glue on to her. There's nothing left in this cursed world of the devil and all his angels that I should like half so well. I'll put him up to it, I will. Arthur and she, indeed. As if a plate of porridge like Arthur would draw a fire-flash like Bab. I'd give the whole litter of 'em and throw in the dam to call that plucky little Robin my girl. I'd give my soul to have such a girl." It did not occur to him that his soul for Barbara would scarcely be fair barter. "Dick's well enough," he went on, "but he's a man, and you've got to quarrel with him. I'm tired of quarreling." The instant she reached home, Mrs. Wilder sent for her daughter and demanded, fury still blazing in her eyes, what she had been doing to give that beast of a Lady Anne a right to talk. "Tell me how she talked, mamma," returned Barbara, used to her mother's ways and nowise annoyed at being so addressed. "I can't have been doing anything very bad, for she's been doing what she can to get me and keep me." "She has, and you never told me." "I didn't think it worth telling you. She's been setting Papa on to me, too." "Oh, I see, and you wouldn't set him and me on each other, dutiful child. You reckoned you'd had enough of that, but I'll have no buying and selling of my goods behind my back. If you speak one more civil word to that young jackanapes Lestrange, you shall hear it again on both your ears." "I will not speak an uncivil word to him, mamma. He has never given me occasion. But I shan't break my heart if I never see him again. If you like, I won't once go near the place. Theodora's the only one I care about, and she's as dull as she is good." What did the kangaroo mean by saying you were sweet on somebody not worthy of you?" "I know what she meant, Mother, but the man is worthy of a far better woman than me, and I hope he'll get her some day." Thereupon little Bab burst into tears, half of rage, half of dread, lest her good wish for Richard should be granted otherwise than she meant it. For she did not at the moment desire very keenly that he should get all he deserved, but that she might herself just do, while she did hope to be a better woman before the day arrived. "Come, come, child, none of that. I don't like it. I don't want to cry on the top of my rage. What is the man? Who is he? What does the woman know about him?" At once Barbara began and told her mother the whole story of Richard and herself. The mother listened. Old days and the memory of a lover not high in the social scale whom she had to give up to marry Mr. Wilder came back upon her, and her heart went with her daughter's before she knew what it was about. Her daughter's love and her own seemed to mingle in one dusky shine, as if the daughter had inherited the mother's experience. The heart of the mother would not have her child, like herself, gather but weed flowers of sorrow among the roses in the garden of love. She had learned this much, that the things the world prizes are of little good to still the hearts of women. But when Barbara told her how Lady Anne would have it that this same Richard, the bookbinder, was a natural son of Sir Wilton, she started to her feet, crying, "Then the natural bookbinder shall have her, and my lady's fool may go to the devil. You shall have my money, Bab, anyhow." "But, Mammy dear," said Barbara, "what will Papa say?" "Poof!" returned her mother. "I've known him too long to care what he says." "I don't like offending him," returned Barbara. "Don't mention him again, child, or I'll turn him loose on your bookbinder. Am I to put my own ewe lamb to the same torture I had to suffer by marrying him? God forbid. When you're happy with your husband, perhaps you'll think of me sometimes and say, 'My mother did it. She wasn't a good woman, but she loved her Bab.'" A passionate embrace followed. Barbara left the room with a happy heart and went, not to her own to brood on her love, but to her brother's, whose feeble voice she heard calling her. Upon him her gladness overflowed. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 55, Miss Brown. The same evening Barbara rode to the smithy, in the hope of hearing some news of Richard from his grandfather. The old man was busy at the anvil when he heard Miss Brown's hoofs on the road. He dropped his hammer, flung the tongs on the forge, and, leaving the iron to cool on the anvil, went to meet her. "How do you do, grandfather?" said Barbara, with unconscious use of the appellation. Simon was well pleased to be called grandfather, but too politic and too well-bred to show his pleasure. "As well as hard work can help me to. How are you yourself, my pretty?" returned Simon. "As well as nothing to do except nursing poor Mark will let me," she answered. "Please, can you tell me anything about Richard yet?" "Can you keep a secret, honey?" rejoined Simon. "I ain't sure as I'm keeping strict within the law, but if I didn't think you fit, I shouldn't say a word." "Don't tell me, if it be anything I ought to tell if I knew it." "If you can show me you ought to tell anyone, I will release you from your promise. But perhaps you feel you ought to tell everything to your mother." "No, not other people's secrets, but I think I won't have it. I don't like secrets. I'm frightened at them." "Then I'll tell you at my own risk, for you've the right sort to trust, promise or no promise. I only hope you will not tell without letting me know first, because then I might have to do something else by way of, what do they call it when you take poison, and then take something to keep it from hurting you? Richard's gone to college." Bab slid from Miss Brown's back, flung her arms with the bridle on one of them round the blacksmith's neck, and, heedless of Miss Brown's fright, jumped up and kissed the old man with the good news. Miss, your clean face," cried the blacksmith. "Oh, Richard, you will be happy now," she said, her voice trembling with buried tears. "But will he ever shoe Miss Brown again, grandfather?" "Many's the time, I trust," answered Simon. "He'll be proud to do it. If not, he never was worth a smile from your sweet mouth." "He'll be a great man some day," she laughed, with a little quiver of the sweet mouth. "He's a good man now, and I don't care," answered the smith. "As long as a son of mine can look every man in the face, I don't care whether it be great or small. He is." "But please, Mr. Armour," said Bab timidly, "wouldn't it be better still if he could look God in the face?" "You're right there, my pretty dove," replied the old man. "Only a body can't say everything out in a breath. But you're right, you are right," he went on. "I remember well the time when I thought I had nothing to be ashamed of. But the time came when I was ashamed of many things, and had done nothing worse in the meantime either. When a man first gets a peep inside himself, he sees things he didn't look to see, and they stagger him a bit. Some horses have their hoofs so shrunk and cockled they take the queerest shoes to set them straight, and them shoes is the troubles of this life, I take it. Now, mind, I ain't told you what college she's gone to, nor whether it be at Oxford or at Cambridge or away in Scotland or Germany, and you don't know. And if you don't feel bound to mention the name of the place, I'd be obliged to you not to. But I will let him know that I've told you what sort of place he's at, because he couldn't tell you himself, being he's bound to hold his tongue." Barbara went home happy. His grandfather recognized the bond between them. As to Richard, she had no fear of his forgetting her. With more energy still, she went about her duties, and they seemed to grow as she did them. As the end of Mark's sickness approached, he became more and more dependent upon her, and only his mother could take her place with him. He loved his father dearly, but his father never stayed more than a moment or two in the sick chamber. Mark at length went away to find his twin, and his mother and Barbara wept, but not all in sorrow. One morning, the week after Mark's death, Mr. Wilder desired Barbara to go with him to his study, where indeed about as much study went on as in a squirrel's nest, and there, after solemn prologue as to it having been right and natural while she was but a girl with a brother that she should be allowed a great deal of freedom, stated that now, circumstances being changed, such freedom could no longer be given her. She was now sole heiress, and must do as an heir would have had to do, namely, consult the interests of the family. In those interests, he continued, it was necessary he should strengthen as much as possible his influence in the county. It was time also that for her own sake she should marry, and better husband or fitter son-in-law than Mr. Lestrange could not be desired. He was both well-behaved and good-looking, and when Mort Grange was one with Wilder, would have by far the finest estate in the county. Filial obligation is a point upon which those parents lay the heaviest stress who have done the least to develop the relation between them and their children. The first duty is from the parent to the child. This unfulfilled, the duty of the child remains untaught. "I am sorry to go against you, Papa," said Barbara, "but I cannot marry Mr. Lestrange." "Stuff and nonsense! Why not?" "Because I do not love him." "Fiddlesticks! I did not love your mother when I married her. You don't dislike him, I know. Now don't tell me you do, for I shall not believe you." "He is always very kind to me, and I am sorry he should want what is not mine to give him." "Not yours to give him? What do you mean by that? If it is not yours, it is mine. Have you not learned yet that when I make up my mind to a thing, that thing is done, and where I have a right, I am not one to waive it?" Where husband and wife are not one, it is impossible for the daughter to be one with both, or perhaps with either, and the constant and foolish bickering to which Barbara had been a witness through her childhood had tended rather to poison than nourish respect. Whether Barbara failed to yield as much as Mr. Wilder had a right to claim, I leave to the judgment of my reader, reserving my own, and remarking only that if his judgment be founded on principles differing from mine, our judgments cannot agree. The idea of parent must be venerated, and may cast a glow upon the actual parent, himself nowise venerable, so that the heart of a daughter may ache with the longing to see her father such as she could love and worship him as she would. But when it comes to life and action, the will of such a parent, if it diverge from what seems to be the child true and right, ought to weigh nothing. A parent is not a maker, is not God. We must leave father and mother and all for God, that is, for what is right, which is his very will. Only let us be sure it is for God and not for self. If the parent has been the parent of good thoughts and right judgments in the child, those good thoughts and right judgments will be on the parent's side. If he has been the parent of evil thoughts and false judgments, they may be for him or against him, but in the end they will work solely for division. Any general decay of filial manners must originate with the parents. "I am not a child, I am a woman," said Barbara, "and I owe it to him who made me a woman to take care of her." "Mind what you say. I have rights and will enforce them." "Over my person," returned Barbara, her eyes sending out a flash that reminded him of her mother and made him the angrier. "If you do not consent here and now," he said sternly, "to marry Mr. Lestrange, that is, if, after your mother's insolence to Lady Anne—" "My mother's insolence to Lady Anne!" exclaimed Barbara, drawing herself in her indignation to the height of her small person, but her father would rush to his own discomfiture. "If, as I say," he went on, "he should now condescend to ask you, I swear—" "You had better not swear, Papa." "I swear you shall not have a foot of my land." "Oh, that is all? There you are in your right, and I have nothing to say." "You insolent hussy, you wouldn't like it when you find it done." "It will be the same as if Mark had lived." "It's that cursed money of your mother's makes you impotent." "If you could leave me moneyless, Papa, it would make no difference. A woman that can shoe her own horse—" "Shoe her own horse!" cried her father. "Yes, Papa, you couldn't, and I made 2 of her shoes the last time. Wouldn't any woman that can do that, wouldn't she, to save herself from shame and disgust, to be queen over herself, wouldn't she take a place as housemaid or shop girl rather than marry the man she doesn't love?" Mr. Wilder saw he had gone too far. "You know more than is good," he said, "but don't you mistake. Your mother's money is settled on you, but your father is your trustee." "My father is a gentleman," rejoined Barbara, not so near the truth as she believed. "Take you care how you push a gentleman," rejoined her father. "Not to love is not to marry, not if the man was a prince," persisted Barbara. She went to her mother's room, but said nothing of what had passed. She would not heat those ovens of wrath, the bosoms of her parents. The next morning she ran to saddle Miss Brown. To her astonishment, her friend was not in her box, nor in any stall in the stable. Neither was anyone visible of whom to ask what had become of her. For the first time in her life, everybody had got out of Barbara's way. In the harness room, however, she came upon one of the stable boys. He was in tears. When he saw her, he started to turn to run, looking as if he had had a piece of Miss Brown for breakfast, but she stopped him. "Where is Miss Brown?" she said. "Don't know, miss." "Who knows, then?" "Perhaps master, miss." "What are you crying for?" "Don't know, miss." "That's not true. Boys don't cry without knowing why." "Well, miss, I ain't sure what I'm crying for." "Speak out, man. Don't be foolish." "Master give me a terrible cut, miss." "Did you deserve it?" "Don't know, miss." "You don't seem to know anything this morning." "No, miss." "What did your master give you the cut for?" "'Cause I was crying." Here he burst into a restrained howl. "What were you crying for?" "Because Miss Brown was gone." "And you cried without knowing where she was gone?" said Barbara, turning almost sick with apprehension. "Yes, miss," affirmed the miserable boy. "Is she dead?" "No, miss, she ain't dead. She's sold." The words were not yet out of his mouth when he turned and bolted. "That's my gentleman, Papa," said Barbara to herself before she could help it. Had she been any girl but Barbara, she would have cried like the boy. Not once from that moment did she allude to Miss Brown in the hearing of father or servant. One day her mother asked her why she never rode, and she told her. The wrath of the mother was like that of a tigress. She sprang to her feet and bounded the door, but when she reached it, Barbara was between her and the handle. "Mother, mother dear," she pleaded. The mother took her by the shoulders and thought to fling her across the room, but she was not so strong as she had been, and she found the little one hard as nails. She could not move her an inch. "Get out of my way," she cried. "I want to kill him." "Mammy dear, listen. It's a month ago. I said nothing for love's sake." "Love's sake? I think I hear you. Dare to tell me you love that wretch of a father of yours? I will kill you if you say you love him." Barbara threw her arms round her mother's neck and said, "Listen, Mammy, I do love him a little bit, but it wasn't for love of him I held my tongue." "Bah! You're a bookbinder, fellow. What has he to do with this?" "Nothing at all. It wasn't for him either. It was for God's sake I held my peace, Mammy. If all his children quarreled like you and Dad, what a house he would have. It was for God's sake I said nothing, and you know, Mammy, you've made it up with God, and you mustn't go and be naughty again." The mother stood silent and still. It seemed for an instant as if the old fever had come back, for she shivered. She turned and went to her chair, sat down, and again was still. A minute after, her forehead flushed like a flame, turned white, then flushed and paled again several times. Then she gave a great sigh, and the conflict was over. She smiled, and from that moment she also never said a word about Miss Brown. But in the silence of her thought, Barbara suffered for what might not be the fate of Miss Brown. No one but a genuine lover of animals would believe how she suffered. In her mind's eye she kept seeing her turn her head with sharp curved neck in her stall, or shoot it over the door of her box, looking and longing for her mistress, and wondering why she did not come to pat her, or feed her, or saddle her for the joyous gallop across grass and green hedge, and the heart of her mistress was sore for her. But at length, one day at church, they read the psalm in which come the words, "Thou, Lord, shalt save both man and beast," and they went to her soul. She reflected that if Miss Brown was in trouble, it might be for the saving of Miss Brown. She had herself got enough good from trouble to hope for that, for she heartily believed the animal partakers in the redemption of Jesus Christ, and she fancied perhaps they knew more about it than we think. The poor things are so silent. Anyhow, she saw that the reasonable thing was to let God look after his own, and if Miss Brown was not his, how could she be? But the mother was sending all over the country to find out who had Miss Brown, and she had not inquired long before she learned that she was in the stables at Mort Grange. There she knew she would be well treated, and therefore told Barbara the result of her inquiries. End of chapter 55.
Chapter 56 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 56. Wingfold and Barbara. Barbara went yet oftener to Mr. and Mrs. Wingfold. By this time, through Simon Armour, they knew something about Richard, but none of them all felt at liberty to talk about him. Barbara had now a better guide in her reading than Richard. True reader as he had been, Wingfold's acquaintance both with literature and its history, that is, its relation to the development of the people, was as much beyond the younger man's as it ought to be. What in Barbara Richard had begun well, Wingfold was carrying on better. With his help she was now studying, to no little advantage, more than one subject connected with the main interest common to her and Richard, and she thought constantly of what Richard would say, and how she would answer him. Hence, naturally, she had the more questions to put to her tutor. Now Wingfold had passed through all Richard's phases, and through some that were only now beginning to show in him. Therefore he was well prepared to help her, although there was this difference between the early moral conditions of the two men, that Wingfold had been prejudiced in favour of much that he found it impossible to hold, whereas Richard had been prejudiced against much that ought to be cast away. Richard suffered not a little at times from his enforced silence. What might not happen because he must not speak? But hearing nothing discouraging from his grandfather, he comforted himself in hope. He knew that in him he had a strong ally, and that Barbara loved the hot-hearted blacksmith, recognizing in him a more genuine breeding, as well as a far greater capacity, than in either Sir Wilton or her father. He toiled on, doing his duty, and receiving in himself the reward of the same, with further reward ever at the door. For there is no juster law than the word, "To him that hath shall be given." "Why do I never see you on Miss Brown?" asked Wingfold one day of Barbara. For a reason I think I ought not to tell you." "Then don't tell me," returned the parson. But by a mixture of instinctive induction and by involuntary intuition, he saw into the piece of domestic tyranny, and did what he could to make up for it, by taking her every now and then a long walk or drive with his wife and their little boy. He gave her strong, hopeful things to read, and in the search after such, was driven to remark how little of the hopeful there is in the English or in any other language. The song of hope is indeed written in men's hearts, but few sing it. Yet it is of all songs the sorest needed of struggling men. Heart and brain, Wingfold was full of both humour and pathos. In their walks and drives, many a serious subject would give occasion to the former, and many a merry one to the latter. Sometimes he would take a nursery rhyme for his theme, and expatiate upon it so, that at one instant Barbara would burst into the gayest laughter, and the next have to restrain her tears. Rarely would Wingfold enter a sick chamber, especially that of a cottage, with a long face and a sermon in his soul. Almost always he walked lightly in, with a cheerful look, and not seldom an odd story on his tongue, well pleased when he could make the sufferer laugh, better pleased sometimes when he had made him sorry. He did not find those that laughed the readiest, the hardest to make sorry. He moved his people by infecting their hearts with the feeling in his own. Having now for many years cared only for the will of God, he was full of joy. For the will of the Father is the root of all his children's gladness, of all their laughter and merriment. The child that loves the will of the Father is at the heart of things. His will is with the motion of the eternal wheels. The eyes of all those wheels are opened upon him, and he knows whence he came. Happy and fearless and hopeful, he knows himself the child of him from whom he came, and his peace and joy break out in light. He rises and shines. Bliss creative and energetic, there is none other, on earth or in heaven, than the will of the Father. End of chapter 56. Recording by HannahMary.
Chapter 57 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 57. The Baronet's Will. Arthur Lestrange was sharply troubled when he found he was to see no more of Barbara. He went again and again to Wilder Hall, but neither mother nor daughter would receive him. When he learned that Miss Brown was for sale, he bought her for love of her mistress. All the explanation he could get from Lady Anne was that the young woman's mother was impossible. She was more than half a savage. Time's wheels went slow thereafter at Montgrange. Sir Wilton missed his firstborn. Whatever annoyed him in his wife, or any of her children, fed the desire for Richard. Arthur did not please him. He had no way distinguished himself, and some men are annoyed when their sons prove only a little better than themselves. Percy was a poisoned thorn in his side. He was even worse than his father. All his thoughts took refuge in Richard. He had become dissatisfied with his agent, and although he had never taken an interest in business, distrust made him now look into things a little. He called his lawyer from London, and had him make a thorough investigation. Dismissing thereupon his agent, he would have Arthur take charge of the estate. But the young man, with an inborn dislike to figures, flatly refused, saying he preferred the army. Sir Wilton did not like the army. He had been in it himself, and had left it in a hurry. No one ever knew why. The only comfort in the house occupied the soul of Lady Anne. It was that she heard nothing of the bookbinder fellow. She had grown so torpid that while danger was not flattening his nose against the window-pane, she was at peace. For the rest, a lawyer of her own had the will in his keeping, and she had come upon no trace of another. But when Sir Wilton sent for his lawyer to look into his factor's accounts, he had a further use for him, of which his wife heard nothing. He made him draw up another will, in which he left everything to Richard, only son of his first wife, Robina Armour. With every precaution for secrecy, the will was signed and witnessed, but when the lawyer would have carried it with him, the baronet declined to give it up. He laid it aside for a week, then had the horses put to, and drove to find Mr. Wingfold, of whom he had heard from Richard. When he saw him, man of the world as he was impressed by the simplicity of a clergyman without a touch of the clerical, without any look of what he called sanctity. The look that comes upon a man cherishing the notion that he is entrusted with things more sacred than God will put in the hands of his other children. Such men, and they are many, one would like to lay for a time in the sheet of Peter's vision, among the four-footed animals and creeping things, to learn that, as there is nothing common or unclean, so is there no class more sacred than another. Never will it be right with men, until every commonest meal is a glad recognition of the living Saviour who gives himself, always and perfectly, to his brothers and sisters. The baronet begged a private interview, and told the parson he wanted to place in his keeping a certain paper, with the understanding that he would not open it for a year after his death, and would then act upon the directions contained in it. Provided always, Wingfold stipulated, that they require of me nothing unfit, impossible, or wrong. I pledge myself they require nothing unworthy of the cloth, said Sir Wilton. The cloth be hanged, said Wingfold. Do they require anything unworthy of a man, or if you think the word means more, of a gentleman? They do not, answered the baronet. Then you must write another paper, stating that you have asked me to undertake this, but that you have given me no hint of the contents of the accompanying document. This second you must enclose with the first, sealing the envelope with your own seal. Sir Wilton at once consented, and there and then did as Wingfold desired. I've checkmated my lady at last, he chuckled as he drove home. She would have me, the villain, to disinherit my firstborn for her miserable brood. She shall find my other will and think she's safe. Then the thunderbolt and Dick Master. My lady's dower won't be much for Percy the cad and Arthur the proper, not to mention Dorothy the cow and Vixen the rat. He always spoke as if Lady Anne's children were none of his. Her ladyship had taught him to do so, for she always said, "My children." That night he slept with an easier mind. He had put the deed off and off, regarding it as his abdication. But now it was done, he felt more comfortable. Wingfold suspected in the papers some provision for Richard, but could imagine no reason for letting it lie unopened until a year should have passed from the baronet's death. Troubling himself nothing, however, about what was not his business, he put the paper carefully aside. But where he must see it now and then, lest it should pass from his mind, and with Sir Wilton's permission, told his wife what he had undertaken concerning it, that she might carry it out if he were prevented from doing so. Time went on. Communication grew yet less between Mr. Wilder and his family. He had returned to certain old habits, and was spending money pretty fast in London. Failing to make himself a god in the house, he forsook it, and was rapidly losing this world's chance of appreciating a woman whose faults were to his as new wine to dirty water. In the 4th year, Richard wrote to his father, through his grandfather, of course, informing him he had got his B.A. degree, and was waiting further orders. The baronet was heartily pleased with the style of his letter, and in the privacy of his own room gave way to his delight at the thought of his wife's approaching consternation and chagrin. At the same time, however, he was not a little uneasy in prospect of the denouement, for the eyes of his wife had become almost a terror to him. Their grey ice, which had not grown clearer as it grew older, made him shiver. Why should the stronger so often be afraid of the weaker? Sometimes, I suppose, because conscience happens to side with the weaker. Sometimes only because the weaker is yet able to make the stronger, especially if he be lazy and a lover of what he calls peace, worse than uncomfortable. The baronet dared not present his son to his wife except in the presence of at least one stranger. He wrote to Richard, appointing a day for his appearance at Montgrange. End of chapter 57.
Chapter 58 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There and Back by George MacDonald, Chapter 58, The Heir. It was a lovely morning when Richard, his heart beating with a hope whose intensity of bliss he had never imagined, stopped at the station nearest to Mort Grange, and set out to walk there in the afternoon sun. June folded him in her loveliness of warmth and color. The grass was washed with transparent gold. He saw both the gold and the green together, but unmingled. Often had he walked the same road, a contented tradesman, a gentleman now with a baronet to his father. He loved and knew he must always love the tradesman uncle more than the baronet father. He was much more than grateful to his father for his ready reception of him and his care of his education, but he could not be proud of him as of his mother and his aunt and uncle and his grandfather. He held it one of God's greatest gifts to come of decent people, and if in his case the decency was on one side only, it was the more his part to stop the current of transmitted evil, and in his own person do what he might to annihilate it. His own anxiety was lest his father should again lay upon him the command to cease communication with his brother and sister. He lifted up his heart to God, and vowed that not for anything the earth could give would he obey. The socialism he had learned from his uncle had undergone a baptism to something infinitely higher. He prayed God to keep him clean of heart and able to hold by his duty. He promised God, it was a way he had when he would bind himself to do right, that he would not forsake his own, and would not break the ties of blood for any law, custom, prejudice, or pride of man. The vow made his heart strong and light, but he felt there was little merit in the act, seeing he could live without his father's favor. He saw how much harder it would be for a poor tradeless man like Arthur Lestrange to make such a resolve. In the face of such a threat from his father, what could he do? Where find courage to resist? Resist he must, or be a slave, but hard indeed it would be. Every father, thought Richard, who loved his children, ought to make them independent of himself, that neither clog, nor net, nor hindrance of any kind might hamper the true working of their consciences. Then would the service they rendered their parents be precious indeed. Then indeed would love be lord, and neither self nor the fear of man nor the fear of fate be a law in their life. He had not sent word to his grandfather that he was coming, and had told his father that he would walk from the station, which suited Sir Wilton, for he felt nervous, and was anxious there should be no stir. So Richard came to Mort Grange as quietly as a star to its place. When he reached the gate and walked in as of old, he was challenged by the woman who kept it. Of all the servants, she and Lady Anne's maid had alone treated him with rudeness, and now she was not polite, although she did not know him. Neither was he recognized by the man who opened the door. Sir Wilton sat in the library expecting him. A gentleman was with him, but he kept in the background, seemingly absorbed in the titles of a row of books. "There you are, you rascal," his father was on the point of saying as Richard came into the light of the one big bow window, but instead he gazed at him for an instant in silence. Before him was one of the handsomest fellows his eyes had ever rested upon, broad-shouldered and tall and straight, with a thoughtful yet keen face, of which every feature was both fine and solid, and dark brown hair with night and firelight in it, and a touch of the sun here and there at moments. The situation might have been embarrassing to a more experienced man than Richard as he waited for his father to speak, but he stood quite at his ease, slightly bent and motionless, neither hands nor feet giving him any of the trouble so far caused by those outlying provinces. The slight color that rose in his rather thin cheeks only softened the beauty of a face whose outline was severe. He stood like a soldier waiting the word of his officer. "By Jove," said his father, and there was another pause. The baronet was momentarily growing prouder of his son. He had never had a feeling like it before. He saw his mother in him. "She's looking at me straight out of his eyes," he said to himself. "Ain't you going to sit down?" he said to him at last, forgetting he had neither shaken hands with him nor spoken a word of welcome. Richard moved a chair a little nearer and sat down, wondering what would come next. "Well, what are you going to do?" asked his father. "I must first know your wish, sir," he answered. "Church won't do?" "No, sir." "Glad to hear it. You're much too good for the church. No offense, Mr. Wingfold. The same applies to yourself." "So my uncle on the stock exchange used to say," answered Wingfold, laughing, as he turned to the baronet. "He thought me good enough, I suppose, for a priest of Mammon." "I'm glad you're not offended. What do you think of that son of mine?" "I have long thought well of him." At the first sound of his voice, Richard had risen and now approached him, his hand outstretched. "Mr. Wingfold," he said joyfully. "I remember now," returned Sir Wilton. "It was from him I heard of you, and that was what made me seek your acquaintance. He promises fairly, don't you think? Shoulders good, head well set on?" "He looks a powerful man," said Wingfold. "We shall be happy to see you, Mr. Lestrange, as soon as you care to come to us." "That will be tomorrow, I hope, sir," answered Richard. Stop, cried Sir Wilton. "We know nothing for certain yet. By the by, if your stepmother don't make you particularly welcome, you needn't be surprised, my boy." "Certainly not. I could hardly expect her to be pleased, sir." "Not pleased? Not pleased at what? Now, don't you presume. Don't you take things for granted. How do you know she will have reason to be displeased? I never promised you anything. I never told you what I intended. Did I ever now?" "No, sir. You have already done far more than ever you promised. You have given me all any man has a right to from his father. I am ready to go to London at once and make my own living." "How?" "I don't know yet. I should have to choose, thanks to you and my uncle." "In the meantime, you must be introduced to your stepmother." "Then, excuse me, Sir Wilton," interposed the parson. "Do you wish me to regard my old friend Richard as your son and heir?" "As my son, yes. As my heir, that will depend—" "On his behavior, I presume," Wingfold ventured. "I say nothing of the sort," replied the baronet testily. "Would you have me doubt whether he will carry himself like a gentleman? The thing depends on my pleasure. There are others besides him." He rose to ring the bell. Richard started up to forestall his intent. "Now, Richard," said his father, turning sharp upon him, "don't be officious. Nothing shows want of breeding more than to do a thing for a man in his own house. It is a cursed liberty." "I will try to remember, sir," answered Richard. "Do. We shall get on the better." He was seized, as by the claw of a crab, with a sharp twinge of the gout. He caught at the back of a chair, hobbled with its help to the table, and so to his seat. Richard restrained himself and stood rigid. The baronet turned a half-humorous, half-reproachful look at him. "That's right," he said. "Never be officious. I wish my father had taught me as I am teaching you. Ever had the gout, Mr. Wingfold?" "Never, Sir Wilton." "Then you ought every Sunday to say, 'Thank God I have no gout.'" "But if we thanked God for all the ills we don't have, there would be no time to thank him for any of the blessings we do have." "What blessings?" "So many! I don't know where to begin to answer you." "Ah, yes, you're a clergyman. I forgot. It's your business to thank God. For my part, being a layman, I don't know anything in particular I've got to thank him for." "If I thought a layman had less to thank God for than a clergyman, I should begin to doubt whether either had anything to thank him for. Why, Sir Wilton, I find everything a blessing. I thank God I am a poor man. I thank him for every good book I fall in with. I thank him when a child smiles at me. I thank him when the sun rises or the wind blows on me. Every day I am so happy, or at least so peaceful, or at the worst so hopeful, that my very consciousness is a thanksgiving." Do you thank him for your wife, Mr. Wingfold? Every day of my existence. The baronet stared at him a moment, then turned to his son. Richard, he said, you had better make up your mind to go into the church. You hear, Mr. Wingfold? I shouldn't like it myself. I should have to be at my prayers all day. Ah, Sir Wilton, it doesn't take time to thank God. It only takes eternity. Sir Wilton stared. He did not understand. Ring the bell, will you? He said. The fellow seems to have gone to sleep. Richard obeyed, and not a word was spoken until the man appeared. Wilkins, said his master, go to my lady and say I beg the favor of her presence in the library for a moment. The man went. No antipathy to cats, I hope, he added, turning to Richard. None, sir, answered Richard gravely. That's good. Then you won't lie taken aback. In a few minutes, she seldom made her husband wait, Lady Anne sailed into the room, the servant closing the door so deftly behind her that it seemed without moving to have given passage to an angelic presence. The two younger men rose. Mr. Wingfold, you know, my lady, said her husband. I have not the pleasure, answered Lady Anne, with a slight motion of the hard bud at the top of her long stock. Ah, I thought you did. The Reverend Mr. Wingfold. Lady Anne, my wife, Mr. Wingfold. The other gentleman, Lady Anne? He paused. Lady Anne turned her eyes slowly on Richard. Wingfold saw a slight, just perceptible start and a settling of the jaws. The other gentleman, resumed the baronet, you do not know, but you will soon be the best of friends. I beg your pardon, Sir Wilton, I do know him. I hope, she went on, turning to Richard, you will keep steadily to your work. The sooner the books are finished, the better. Richard smiled, but what he was on the point of saying, his father prevented. You mistake, my lady. I thought you did not know him, said the baronet. That gentleman is my son, and will one day be Sir Richard. Oh, returned her ladyship, without a shadow of change in her impassivity, except Wingfold was right in fancying the slightest movement of squint in the eye next to him. She held out her hand. This is unexpected. For once in her life her lips were truer than her heart. They did not say pleasure. Richard took her hand respectfully, sad for the woman whose winter had no fuel, and who looked as if she would be cold to all eternity. Lady Anne stared him in the eye and said, My favorite prayer book has come to pieces at last. Perhaps you would bind it for me? I shall be delighted, answered Richard. Thank you, she said, bowed to Wingfold, and left the room. Sir Wilton sat like an offended turkey-cock, staring after. By Jove, he seemed to say to himself. There, that's over, he cried, coming to himself. Ring the bell, Richard, and let us have lunch. Richard, no gentleman could have behaved better. I am proud of you. It's blood that does it, he murmured to himself. As if he had himself compounded both his own blood and his boy's in the still room of creation, he took all the credit of Richard's savoir-faire, as he counted it. He did not know that the same thing made Wingfold happy and Richard a gentleman. Richard had had a higher breeding than was known to Sir Wilton. At the court of courts, whether the manners of some other courts would be swept as dust from the floors, the baronet would hardly gain admittance. Lady Anne went up the stairs slowly and perpendicularly, a dull pain in her heart. The cause was not so much that her son was the second son as that the son of the blacksmith's daughter was, she took care to say it at first sight, a finer gentleman than her Arthur. Rank and position, she vaguely reflected, must not look for justice from the jealous heavens. They always sided with the poor. Just see the party spirit of the Psalms. The rich and noble were hardly dealt with. Nowadays even the church was with the radicals. The baronet was merry over his luncheon. The servants wondered at first, but before the soup was removed they wondered no more. The young man at the table, in whom not one of them had recognized the bookbinder, was the lost heir to Mort Grange. He was worth finding, they agreed, one who would hold his own. The house would be merrier now, thank heaven. They liked Mr. Arthur well enough, but here was his master. The meal was over, and the baronet always slept after lunch. "You'll stay to dinner, won't you, Mr. Wingfold?" he said, rising. "Richard, ring the bell. Better send for Mrs. Locke at once and arrange with her where you will sleep." "Then I may choose my own room, sir," rejoined Richard. "Of course, but better not too near my ladies," answered his father with a grim smile as he hobbled from the room. When the housekeeper came, "Mrs. Locke," said Richard, "I want to see the room that used to be the nursery. In the older time, I mean." "Yes, sir," answered Mrs. Locke pleasantly, and led them up 2 flights of stairs and a long corridor and passage to the room Richard had before occupied. He glanced around it and said, "This shall be my room. Will you kindly get it ready for me?" She hesitated. It had certainly not been repapered, as Sir Wilton thought, and had said to Mrs. Tuke. To Mrs. Locke it seemed uninhabitable by a gentleman. "I will send for the painter and paper hanger at once," she replied, "but it will take more than a week to get ready." "Pray leave it as it is," he answered. "You can have the floor swept, of course," he added with a smile, seeing her look of dismay. "I will sleep here tonight, and we can settle afterward what is to be done to it. There used to be a portrait," he went on, "over the chimney-piece, the portrait of a lady, not well painted, I fancy, but I liked it. What has become of it?" Then first it began to dawn on Mrs. Locke that the young man who mended the books and the heir to Mort Grange were the same person. It fell down one day and has not been put up again," she answered. "Do you know where it is?" "I will find it, sir." "Do, if you please. Whose portrait is it?" "The last Lady Lestrange's, sir. But bless my stupid old head, it's his own mother's picture he's asking for. You'll pardon me, sir. The thing's more bewildering than you think. I'll go and get it at once." "Thank you. Mr. Wingfold and I will wait till you bring it." "There ain't anywhere for you to sit, sir," lamented the old lady. "If I'd only known, I'm sure, sir, I wish you joy." "Thank you, Mrs. Locke. We'll sit here on the mattress." Richard had not forgotten how the eyes of the picture used to draw his, and he had often since wondered whether it could be the portrait of his mother. In a few minutes Mrs. Locke reappeared, carrying the portrait, which had never been put in a frame, and knotting the cord, Richard hung it again on the old nail. It showed a well-formed face, but very flat and wooden. The eyes, however, were comparatively well painted, and it seemed to Richard that he could read both sorrow and disappointment in them, with a yearning after something she could not have. They went out for a ramble in the park, and there Richard told his friend as much as he knew of his story, describing as well as he understood them the changes that had passed upon him in the matter of religion, and making no secret of what he owed to the expostulations and spiritual resistances of Barbara. Wingfold, after listening with profound attention, told him he had passed through an experience in many points like, and at the root the same as his own, adding that, long before he was sure of anything, it had become more than possible for him to keep going on, and that still he was but looking and hoping and waiting for a fuller dawn of what had made his being already blessed. They consulted whether Wingfold should act on the baronet's careless invitation, and concluded it better he should not stay to dinner. Then, as there was yet time, and it was partly on Wingfold's way, they set out for the smithy. End of chapter 58. End of There and Back by George MacDonald.
Chapter 59 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 59. Wingfold and Arthur Manson. When the first delight of their meeting was abated, Simon sent to let Arthur Manson know that his brother was there. For Arthur had all this time been living with Simon, to whom Richard, saving enough from his allowance, had prevented him from being a burden. He looked much better, and was enchanted to see his brother again, and learn the good news of his recognition by his father. "I'm so glad it's you and not me, Richard," he said. "It makes me feel quite safe and happy. We shall have nothing now but fair play all round, the rest of our lives. How happy Alice will be!" "Is Alice still in the old place? I haven't heard of her for some time," said Richard. "Don't you know," exclaimed Arthur, "she's been at the parsonage for months and months. Mrs. Wingfold went and fetched her away to work for her, and be near me. She's as happy now as the day is long. She says if everybody was as good as her master and mistress, there would be no misery left in the world." "I don't doubt it," answered Richard. "But I've just parted with Mr. Wingfold, and he didn't say a word about her." "When anything has to be done, Mr. Wingfold never forgets it," said Arthur. "But I should just like to hear all the things Mr. Wingfold did and forgot in a month." "Arthur's getting on," thought Richard. But he had to learn how much Wingfold had done for him. First of all, he had set himself, by talking to him and lending him books, to find out his bent, or at least something he was capable of. But for months he could not wake him enough to know of anything of what was in him. The poor fellow was weary almost to death. At last, however, he got him to observe a little. Then he began to set him certain tasks, and as he was an invalid, the first was what he called the task of 12 o'clock, which was for a quarter of an hour from every noon during a month to write down what he then saw going on in the world. The first day he had nothing to show. He had seen nothing. "What were the clouds doing?" Mr. Wingfold asked. "What were the horses in the fields doing? What were the birds you saw doing? What were the ducks and hens doing? Put down whatever you see any creature about." The next evening he went to him again, and asked him for his paper. Arthur handed him a folded sheet. "Now," said Mr. Wingfold, "I am not going to look at this for the present. I am going to lay it in one of my drawers, and you must write another for me tomorrow. If you are able, bring it over to me. If not, lay it by and do not look at it, but write another and another, one every day, and give them all to me the next time I come, which will be soon. We shall go on that way for a month, and then we shall see something." At the end of the month, Mr. Wingfold took all the papers and fastened them together in their proper order. Then they read them together, and did indeed see something. The growth of Arthur's observation, both in extent and quality, also the growth of his faculty for narrating what he saw, were remarkable, both to himself and his instructor. The number of things and circumstances he was able to see by the end of the month, compared with the number he had seen in the beginning of it, was wonderful, while the mode of his record had changed from that of a child to that of almost a man. Mr. Wingfold next, as by that time the weather was quite warm, set him the task of 6 o'clock in the evening, when the things that presented themselves to his notice would be very different. After a fortnight he changed again the hour of his observation, and went on changing it, so that at length the youth who had twice every day walked along Cheapside almost without seeing that one face differed from another, knew most of the birds and many of the insects, and could in general tell what they were about, while the domestic animals were his familiar friends. He delighted in the grass and the wild flowers, the sky and the clouds and the stars, and knew, after a real, vital fashion, the world in which he lived. He entered into the life that was going on about him, and so, in the house of God, became one of the family. He had 10 times his former consciousness. His life was 10 times the size it was before. As was natural, his health had improved marvelously. There's nothing like interest in life to quicken the vital forces, the secret of which is that they are left freer to work. Richard was rejoiced with the change in him, and reckoned of what he might learn from Arthur in the long days before them, while he in turn would tell him many things he would now be prepared to hear. The soul that had seemed rapidly sinking into the joyless dark was now burning, clear as a torch of heaven. End of chapter 59. Recording by HannahMary. comebestill.blogspot.com.
Chapter 60 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 60. Richard and his Family. As the dinner hour grew nigh, Richard went to the drawing-room, scrupulously dressed. Lady Anne gave him the coldest of polite recognitions. Theodora was full of a gladness hard to keep within the bounds which fear of her mother counselled. Victoria was scornful, and as impudent as she dared be in the presence of her father. Miss Maliver was utterly wooden, and behaved as if she had never seen him before. Arthur was polite and superior. Things went pretty well, however. Percy, happily, was at Woolwich, pretending to study engineering. Of him Richard had learned too much at Oxford. Theodora and Richard were at once drawn to each other, he prejudiced in her favour by Barbara, she proud of her new handsome brother. She was a plain, good-natured, good-tempered girl, with red hair, which only her father and mother disliked, and a modest, freckled face, whose smile was genuine and faith-inspiring. Her mother counted her stupid, accepting the judgment of the varnished governess, who saw wonder or beauty or value in nothing her eyes or hands could not reach. Theodora was indeed one of those who, for lack of true teaching, or from the deliberateness of nature, continued children longer than most, but she was not therefore stupid. The aloe takes 7 years to blossom, but when it does, its flower may be 30 feet long. Where there is love, there is intellect. At what period it may show itself matters little. Richard felt he had in her another sister, one for whom he might do something. He talked freely, as became him at his father's table, and the conversation did not quite flag. If Lady Anne said next to nothing, she said nearly as much as usual, and was perfectly civil. Arthur was sullen, but not rude. Theodora's joy made her talk as she had never talked before. A morn of romance had dawned upon her commonplace life. Vixen gave herself to her dinner, and but the shadow of a grimace now and then reminded Richard of the old monkey Phiz. Having the heart of a poet, the brain of a scientist, and the hands of a workman, hands, that is, made for making, Richard talked so vitally that in most families not one but all would have been interested, and indeed Arthur too would have enjoyed listening, but that he was otherwise occupied. That he had to look unconcerned at his own deposition, while regarding as an intruder the man whose place he had so long in a sense usurped, was not his sorest trial. Regarding as a prig the man who talked about things worth talking about, he could not help feeling himself a poor creature, an empty sack, beside the son of the low-born woman. But indeed Richard, brought face to face with life, and taught to meet necessity with labour, had had immeasurable advantages over Arthur. The younger insisted to himself that his brother could not have the feelings of a gentleman, that he must have poverty-stricken ways of looking at things. He could, it was true, find nothing in his manners, carriage, or speech unlike a gentleman, but the vulgarity must be there, and he watched to find it, for he was not himself a gentleman yet. When they went to the drawing-room, and Richard had sung a ballad so as almost to make Lady Anne drop a scale or two from her fish eyes, Arthur went out of the room stung with envy and not ashamed of it. The thing most alien to the true idea of humanity is the notion that our well-being lies in surpassing our fellows. We have to rise above ourselves, not above our neighbours, to take all the good of them, not from them, and give them all our good in return. That which cannot be freely shared can never be possessed. Arthur went to his room with a gnawing at his heart. Not merely must he knock under to the foundling, but confess that the foundling could do most things better than he, was out of sight his superior in accomplishment as well as education. But let us see how he rides and shoots, he thought. Even Vixen, who had been saying to herself all the time of dinner, "Mean fellow, to come like a fox and steal poor Arthur's property. Even she was cowed a little by his singing, and felt for the moment in the presence of her superior. Sir Wilton was delighted. Here was a son to represent him, the son of the woman the county had declined to acknowledge. What was Lady Anne's plebeian litter beside this high-bred, modest, self-possessed fellow? He was worthy of his father, by Jove. He went early to bed, and Richard was not sorry. He too retired early, leaving the rest to talk him over. How they did it I do not care to put on record. Theodora said little, for her heart had come awake with a new and lovely sense of gladness and hope. If he would but fall in love with Barbara Wilder, she thought, or rather if Barbara would but fall in love with him, for nobody can help falling in love with her. How happy I should be! They are the two I love best in the world. Next to Papa and Mamma, of course, she added, being a loyal girl. The next morning Richard came upon Arthur shooting at a mark, and both with pistols and rifle beat him thoroughly. But when Arthur began to talk about shooting pheasants, he found in Richard a rooted dislike to killing. This moved Arthur's contempt. "Keep it dark," he said. "You'll be laughed at if you don't. My father won't like it." "Why must a man enjoy himself at the expense of joy?" answered Richard. "I pass no judgment upon your sport. I merely say I don't choose to kill birds. What men may think of me for it is a matter of indifference to me. I think of them much as they think of a Frenchman or an Italian who shoots larks and blackbirds and thrushes and nightingales. I don't see the great difference." They strolled into the stable. There stood Miss Brown, looking over the door of her box. She received Richard with glad recognition. "How comes Miss Brown here?" he asked. "Where can her mistress be?" "The mare's at home," answered Arthur. "I bought her." "Oh," said Richard, and going into the box, lifted her foot and looked at the shoe. Alas, Miss Brown had worn out many shoes since Barbara drove a nail in her hoof. Had there been one of hers there, he would have known it, by a pretty peculiarity in the turn of the point back into the hoof, which she called her mark. The mare sniffed about his head in friendly fashion. "She smells the smithy," said Arthur to himself. "Yes, your grandfather's work," he remarked. "I should be sorry to see any other man shoe horse of mine." "So should I," answered Richard. "I wonder why Miss Wilder sold Miss Brown," he said after a pause. "I am not so curious," rejoined Arthur. "She sold her, and I bought her." Neither divined that the animal stood there a sacrifice to Barbara's love of Richard. Arthur had given up hope of winning Barbara, but the thought that the bookminder fellow might now, as he vulgarly phrased it to himself, go in and win, swelled his heart with a yet fiercer jealousy. "I hate him," he said in his heart. Yet Arthur was not a bad fellow as fellows go. He was only a man for himself, believing every man must be for himself, and count the man in his way his enemy. He was just a man who had not begun to stop being a devil. At breakfast, Lady Anne was almost attentive to her stepson. As it happened, they were left alone at the table. Suddenly she addressed him. "Richard, I have one request to make of you," she said. "I hope you will grant it me." "I will if I can," he answered, "but I must not promise without knowing what it is." "You do not feel bound to please me, I know. I have the misfortune not to be your mother. I feel bound to please you where I can, and shall be more than glad to do so. It is a small thing I am going to ask. I should not have thought of mentioning it, but for the terms you seem upon with Mr. Wingfold. I hope to see him within an hour or so. I thought as much. Do you happen to remember a small person who came a good deal about the house when you were at work here? If your ladyship means Miss Wilder, I remember her perfectly. It is necessary to let you know, and then I shall leave the matter to your good sense. that Mrs. Wilder, and indeed the girl herself at various times, has behaved to me with such rudeness that you cannot in ordinary decency have acquaintance with them. I mention it in case Mr. Wingfold should want to take you to see them. They are parishioners of his." "I am sorry I must disappoint you," said Richard. Lady Anne rose with a grey glitter in her eyes. "Am I to understand you intend calling on the Wilders?" she said. "I have imperative reasons for calling upon them this very morning," answered Richard. "I am sorry you should so immediately show your antagonism," said Lady Anne. "My obligations to Miss Wilder are such that I must see her the first possible moment." "Have you asked your father's permission?" "I have not," answered Richard, and left the room hurriedly. The next moment he was out of the house. Lady Anne might go to his father, and he would gladly avoid the necessity of disobeying him the first morning after his return. He did not know how small was her influence with her husband. He took the path across the fields and ran until he was out of sight of Mortgrange. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 61. Heart to Heart. When he came to the parsonage, which he had to pass on his way to the hall, he saw Mr. Wingfold through the open window of the drawing-room and turned to the door. The parson met him on the threshold. "Welcome," he said. "How did you get through your dinner?" "Better than I expected," replied Richard. "But this morning my stepmother began feeling my mouth. She would have me promise not to call on the Wilders. They had been rude to her, she said. Come into the drawing-room. A friend of mine is there who will be glad to see you." The drawing-room of the parsonage was low and dark, with its two windows close together on the same side. At the farther end stood a lady, seemingly occupied with an engraving on the wall. She did not move when they entered. Wingfold led Richard up to her, then turned without a word and left the room. Before either knew, they were in each other's arms. Barbara was sobbing. Richard thought he had dared too much and had frightened her. "I couldn't help it," Barbara said pleadingly. "My life has been a longing for you," said Richard. "I've wanted you every day," said Barbara, and began again to sob, but recovered herself with an effort. "This will never do," she cried, laughing through her tears. "I shall go crazy with having you, and I've not seen you yet. Let me go, please. I want to look at you." Richard released her. She lifted a blushing, tearful face to his. But there was only joy, no pain in her tears, only delight, no shame in her blushes. One glance at the simple, manly face before her, so full of the trust that induces trust, would have satisfied any true woman that she was as safe in his thoughts as in those of her mother. She gazed at him one long, silent moment. "How splendid you are!" she cried like a wild schoolgirl. "How good of you to grow like that! I wish I could see you on Miss Brown. What are you going to do, Richard?" While she spoke, Richard was pasturing his eyes, the two mouths of his soul, on the heavenly meadow of her face, and she for very necessity went on talking that she might not cry again. "Are you going back to the bookbinding?" she said. "I do not know. Sir Wilton, my father, hasn't told me yet what he wants me to do. Wasn't it good of him to send me to Oxford?" "You've been at Oxford then all this time? I suppose he will make an officer of you now. Not that I care. I am content with whatever contents you." I dare say he will hardly like me to live by my hands, answered Richard, laughing. He would count it a degradation. There I shall never be able to think like a gentleman. Barbara looked perplexed. You don't mean to say he's going to treat you just like one of the rest? She exclaimed. I really do not know, answered Richard, but I think he would hardly enjoy the thought of Sir Richard Lestrange over a bookbinder's shop in Hammersmith or Brentford. Sir Richard, you do not mean... Her face grew white, her eyes fell, her hand trembled on Richard's arm. What is troubling you, dearest? He asked, in his turn perplexed. I cannot understand it, she answered. Is it possible you do not know, Barbara? He returned. I thought Mr. Wingfold must have told you. Sir Wilton says I am his son that was lost. Indeed, there is no doubt of it. Richard, Richard, believe me, I didn't know. Lady Anne told me you were not... How then should I have dared put my arms round you, Barbara? Richard, I care nothing for what the world thinks. I care only for what God thinks. Then, Barbara, you would have married me, believing me base-born? Oh, Richard, you thought it was knowing who you were that made me... Richard, Richard, I did not think you could have wronged me so. My father sold Miss Brown because I would not marry your brother and be Lady Lestrange. If you had not asked me, and I had been sure it was only because of your birth you wouldn't, I should have found some way of letting you know I cared no more for that than God himself does. The God of the world is the devil. He has many names, but he's all the same devil, as Mr. Wingfold says. I wonder why he never told me. I'm glad he didn't. If he had, I shouldn't be here now. I am very glad too, Barbara, but it wouldn't have made so much difference. I was only here on my way to you. But suppose it had been as you thought. It was one thing what you would do, and another what I would ask you to do. What I would have done was what you should have believed I would do. You must just pardon me, Barbara. Well as I thought I knew you, I did not know you enough. You do now? I do. There came a silence. How long have you known this about yourself, Richard? Said Barbara. More than 4 years. And you never told me? My father wished it kept a secret for a time. Did Mr. Wingfold know? Not till yesterday. Why didn't he tell me yesterday, then? I think he wouldn't have told you if he had known all the time. Why? For the same reason that made him leave us together so suddenly, that you might not be hampered by knowing it, that we might understand each other before you knew. I see it all now. It was just like him. Oh, he is a friend, cried Barbara. He knows what one is, and so knows what one is thinking. A silent embrace followed, and then Barbara said, You must come and see my mother. Hadn't you better tell her first? Suggested Richard. She knows what you didn't know, what I've been thinking all the time, rejoined Barbara, with a rosy look of confidence into his eyes. She can never have been willing you should marry a tradesman, and one besides who... She knew I would, and that I should have money, else she might not have been willing. I don't say she likes the idea, but she is determined I shall have the man I love, if he will have me, she added shyly. Did you tell her you cared for me? He could not say loved yet. He felt an earthy pebble beside a celestial sapphire. Of course I did. When Papa wanted me to have Arthur. Not till then. There was no occasion. I could not tell what your thoughts were, but my own were enough for that. Mrs. Wilder was taken with Richard the moment she saw him, and when she heard his story she was overjoyed and would scarcely listen to a word about the uncertainty of his prospects. That her Bab should marry the man she loved, and that the alliance should be what the world counted respectable, was enough for her. When Richard told his father what he had done, saying they had fallen in love with each other while yet ignorant of his parentage, a glow of more than satisfaction warmed Sir Wilton's consciousness. It was lovely. Lady Anne was being fooled on all sides. "Richard has been making good use of his morning," he said at dinner. "He has already proposed to Miss Wilder and been accepted. Richard is a man of action, a practical fellow." Lady Anne did perhaps turn a shade paler, but she smiled. It was not such a blow as it might have been, for she too had given up hope of securing her for Arthur. But it was not pleasant to her that the grandchild of the blacksmith should have Barbara's money. Theodora was puzzled. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 62. The Quarrel. For a few weeks things went smoothly enough. Not a jar occurred in the feeble harmony, not a questionable cloud appeared above the horizon. The home weather seemed to have grown settled. Lady Anne was not unfriendly. Richard, having provided himself with tools for the purpose, bound her prayer book in violet velvet, with her arms cut out in gold on the cover, and she had not seemed altogether ungrateful. Arthur showed no active hostility, made indeed some little fight with himself to behave as a brother ought to a brother he would rather not have found. Far from inseparable, they were yet to be seen together about the place. Vixen had not once made a face to his face. I will not say she had made none at his back. Theodora and he were fast friends. Miss Maliver, now a sort of upper slave to Lady Anne, cringed to him. Arthur readily sold him Miss Brown, and every day she carried him to Barbara. But he took the advice of Wingfold, and was not long from home any day, but much at hand to his father's call, who had many things for him to do, and was rejoiced to find him, unlike Arthur, both able and ready. He would even send him where a domestic might have done as well, but Richard went with hearty good will. It gladdened him to be of service to the old man. Then a rumour reached his father's ears, carried to Lady Anne by her elderly maid, that Richard had been seen in low company, and he was not long in suspecting the truth of the matter. Not once before since Richard's return had Sir Wilton given the Mansons a thought, never doubting his son's residence at Oxford must have cured him of a merely accidental inclination to such low company, and made evident to him that recognition of such relationship as his to them was an unheard of impropriety, a sin against social order, a class treachery. Almost every day Richard went to Wilder Hall, he had a few minutes with Alice at the parsonage. Neither Barbara nor her lawless, great-hearted mother would have been pleased to have it otherwise. Barbara treated Alice as a sister, and so did Helen Wingfold, who held that such service as hers must be recompensed with love and the money thrown in. Their kindness, with her new peace of heart, and plenty of food and fresh air, had made her strong and almost beautiful. It was Richard's custom to ride over in the morning, but one day it was more convenient for him to go in the evening, and that same evening it happened that Arthur Manson had gone to see his sister. When Richard, on his way back from the Hall, found him at the parsonage, he proposed to see him home. Miss Brown was a good walker, and if Arthur did not choose to ride all the way, they would ride and walk alternately. Arthur was delighted, and they set out in the dusk on foot, Alice going a little way with them. Richard led Miss Brown, and Alice clung joyously to his arm. But for Richard, she would not have known that human being ever was or could be so happy. The western sky was a smoky red. The stars were coming out. The wind was mild, and seemed to fill her soul with life from the fountain of life, from God himself. For Alice had been learning from Barbara not to think things, but to feel realities, the reality of real things, to see truths themselves. Often, when Mrs. Wingfold could spare her, Barbara would take her out for a walk. Then sometimes, as they walked, she would quite forget her presence, and through that very forgetting, Alice learned much. When first she saw Barbara lost in silent joy, and could see nothing to make her look glad, she wondered a moment, then swiftly concluded she must be thinking of God. When she saw her spread out her arms as if to embrace the wind that flowed to meet them, then too she wondered, but presently began to feel what a thing the wind was, how full of something strange and sweet. She began to learn that nothing is dead, that there cannot be a physical abstraction, that nothing exists for the sake of the laws of its phenomena. She did not put it so to herself, I need hardly say, but she was, in a word, learning to feel that the world was alive. Of the three, she was the merriest that night as they went together along the quiet road. A little way out of the village, Richard set her on the mare and walked by her side, leading Miss Brown. Such was the tolerably sufficient foundation for the report that he was seen rollicking with a common-looking lad and a servant girl on the high road in the immediate vicinity of Wilder Hall. "He is his father's son," reflected Lady Anne. "He's a chip of the old block," said Sir Wilton to himself. But he did not approve of the openness of the thing. To let such doings be seen was low. Presently fell an ugly light on the affair. "By Jove," he said to himself, "it's the damned Manson girl. I'll lay my life on it. The fellow is too much of a Puritan to flaunt his own foibles in the public eye, but damn him, he don't love his father enough not to flaunt his. Dead and buried, the rascal hauls them out of their graves for men to see. It's all the damned socialism of his mother's relations. Otherwise, the fellow would be all a father could wish. I might have known it. The Armour blood was sure to break out. What business had he with what his father did before he was born? He was nowhere then, the insolent dog. He shall do as I tell him, or go about his business. Go and herd with the Mansons and all the rest of them if he likes, and be hanged to them." He sat in smouldering rage for a while, and then again his thoughts took shape in words, though not in speech. "How those fools of Wilders will squirm when I cut the rascal off with a shilling, and settle the property on the man the little lady refused. But Dick will never be such a fool. He cannot reconcile his Puritanism with such brazen-faced conduct. I shall never make a gentleman of him. He will revert to the original type. It had disappeared in his mother. What's bred in the damned bone will never out of the damned flesh." Richard was at the moment walking with Mr. Wingfold in the rectory garden. They were speaking of what the Lord meant when he said a man must leave all for him. As soon as he entered his father's room, he saw that something had gone wrong with him. "What is it, father?" he said. "Richard, sit down," said Sir Wilton. "I must have a word with you. What young man and woman were you walking with 2 nights ago, not far from Wilder Hall?" "My brother and sister, sir, the Mansons." "My God, I thought as much!" cried the baronet, and started to his feet, but sat down again. The fetter of his gout pulled him back. "Hold up your right hand," he went on. Sir Wilton was a magistrate. "And swear by God that you will never more in your life speak one word to either of those persons, or leave my house at once." "Father," said Richard, his voice trembling a little, "I cannot obey you. To deny my friends and relations, even at your command, would be to forsake my master. It would be to break the bonds that bind men, God's children, together." "Hold your cursed jargon! Bonds, indeed! Is there no bond between you and your father?" "Believe me, father, I am very sorry, but I cannot help it. I dare not obey you. You have been very kind to me, and I thank you from my heart." "Shut up, you young hypocrite! You have tongue enough for 3. Come, I will give you 1 chance more. Drop those persons you call your brother and sister, or I drop you." "You must drop me then, father," said Richard with a sigh. "Will you do as I tell you?" "No, sir, I dare not." "Then leave the house." Richard rose. "Good-bye, sir," he said. "Get out of the house." "May I not take my tools, sir?" "What tools, damn you?" "I got some to bind Lady Anne's prayer book." "She's taken him in. By Jove, she's done him, the fool. She's been keeping him up to it, to enrage me and get rid of him," said the baronet to himself. "What do you want them for?" he asked, a little calmer. "To work at my trade. If you turn me out, I must go back to that." "Damn your soul! It never was and never will be anything but a tradesman's. Damn my soul, if I wouldn't rather make young Manson my heir than you. No, by Jove, you shall not have your damned tools. Leave the house. You cannot claim a chair leg in it." Richard bowed and went, got his hat and stick, and walked from the house with about 30 shillings in his pocket. His heart was like a lump of lead, but he was nowise dismayed. He was in no perplexity how to live. Happy the man who knows his hands the gift of God, the providers for his body. I would in especial that teachers of righteousness were able, with St. Paul, to live by their hands. Outside the lodge gate he paused, and stood in the middle of the road thinking. Thus far he had seen his way, but no farther. To which hand must he turn? Should he go to his grandfather or to Barbara? He set out, plodding across the fields, for Wilder Hall. There was no Miss Brown for him now. Miss Wilder, they told him, was in the garden. She sat in a summer-house reading a story. When she heard his step, she knew, from the very sound of it, that he was discomposed. Never was such a creature for interpreting the signs of the unseen. Her senses were as discriminating as those of wild animals that have not only to find life, but to avoid death by the keenness of their wits. She came out and met him in the dim green air under a wide-spreading yew. "What is the matter, Richard?" she said, looking in his face with anxiety. "What has gone wrong?" "My father has turned me out." "Turned you out?" "Yes. I must swear never to speak another word to Alice or Arthur, or go about my business. I went." "Of course you did," cried Barbara, lifting her dainty chin an inch higher. Then, after a little pause, in which she looked with loving pride straight into his eyes, for was he not a man after her own brave, big heart, she resumed. "Well, it is no worse for you than before, and ever so much better for me. What are you going to do, Richard? There are so many things you could turn to now." "Yes, but only one I can do well. I might get fellows to coach, but I should have to wait too long, and then I should have to teach what I thought worth neither the time nor the pay. I prefer to live by my hands and earn leisure for something else." "I like that," said Barbara. "Will it take you long to get into the way of your old work?" "I don't think it will," answered Richard, "and I believe I shall do better at it now. I was looking at some of it yesterday morning, and was surprised I should have been pleased with it. In myself growing, I have grown to demand better work, better both in idea and execution." "It is horrid to have you go," said Barbara, "but I will think you up to God every day, and dream about you every night, and read about you every book. I will write to you, and you will write to me, and—" She was on the point of crying, but would not. And then the old smell of the leather and the paste will be so nice." She broke into a merry laugh, and the crisis was over. They walked together to the smithy. Fierce was the wrath of the blacksmith. But for the presence of Barbara, he would have called his son-in-law ugly names. His anger soon subsided, however, and he laughed at himself for spending indignation on such a man. "I might have known him by this time," he said, "but just let him come near the smithy," he resumed, and his eyes began to flame again. "He shall know, if he does, what a blacksmith thinks of a baronet. What are you going to do, my son?" "Go back to my work." "Never to that old wife trade?" cried the blacksmith. "Look here, Richard," he said, and bared his upper arm. "There's what the anvil does." Then he bent his shoulders and began to wheeze. "And there's what the bookbinding does," he continued. No, you turn in with me, and we'll show them a sight. A gentleman that can make his living with his own hands. The country shall see Sir Wilton Lestrange's heir a blacksmith, because he wouldn't be a snob and deny his own flesh and blood. I saw your son to-day, Sir Wilton, at the anvil with his grandfather. What a fine fellow he do be! Lord, how he do make the sparks fly! If I had him, the old sinner, he should see sparks that came from somewhere else than the anvil. You turn in with me, Richard, and do work fit for a man." "Grandfather," answered Richard, "I couldn't do your work so well as my own." "Yes, you could. In 6 weeks you'll be a better smith than ever you'd be a bookbinder. There's no good or bad in that sort of soft thing. I'll make you a better blacksmith than myself. There! I can't say fairer." "But don't you think it better not to irritate my father more than I must? I oughtn't to torment him. As long as I was here, he would fancy me braving him. When I am out of sight, he may think of me again and want to see me, as Job said his Maker would." "I don't remember," said Barbara. "Tell me." "He says to God, I was reading it the other day, 'I wish you would hide me in the grave till you've done being angry with me. Then you would want to see again the creature you had made. You would call me, and I would answer.' God's not like that, of course, but my father might be. There's more chance of his getting over it if I don't trouble him with sight or sound of me." "Well, perhaps you're right," said Simon. "Off with you to your woman's work, and God bless you." End of chapter 62. Chapter 63 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 63. Baronet and Blacksmith. Richard took Barbara home, and the same night started for London. Barbara prayed him to take what money she had, but he said that by going in the 3rd class he would have something over, and, once there, would begin to earn money immediately. His aunt was almost beside herself for lack of outlet to her surprise and delight at seeing him. When she heard his story, however, it was plain she took part with his father, though she was too glad to have her boy again to say so. His uncle, too, was sincerely glad. His work had not been the same thing to him since Richard went, and to have him again was what he had never hoped. He could not help a grudge that Richard should lose his position for the sake of such as the Mansons, but he saw now the principle involved. He saw, too, that, in virtue of his belief in God as the Father of all, his nephew had much the stronger sense of the claim of man upon man. Richard never disputed with his uncle. He but suggested, and kept suggesting, in the firm belief that an honest mind must, sooner or later, open its doors to every truth. He settled to his work as if he had never been away from it, and in a fortnight or so could work faster and better than before. Soon he had as much in his peculiar department as he was able to do, for almost all his old employers again sought him. His story being now no secret, they wondered he should return to his trade, but no one thought he had chosen to be a workman because he was not a gentleman. But how changed was the world to him since the time that looked so far away! With how much larger a life in his heart would he now sit in the orchestra, while the gracious forms of music filled the hall, and he seemed to see them soaring on the pinions of the birds of God, as Dante calls the angels, or sweeping level in dance divine, like the six-winged serpents of Isaiah's vision, high and lifted up, all the interspaces filled with glowworms and little spangled snakes of coruscating sound. He was more blessed now than even when but to lift his eyes was to see the face of Barbara. She was in his faith and hope now as well as in his love. He had the loveliest of letters from her. She insisted he should not write oftener than once for her twice. His time was worth more, she said, than twice hers. Mr. Wingfold wrote occasionally, and Richard always answered within a week. As soon as his son was gone, Sir Wilton began to miss him. He wished first that the obstinacy of the rascal had not made it necessary to give him quite so sharp a lesson. He wished next that he had given him time to see the reasonableness of his demand, and at length, as the days and weeks passed, and not a whisper of prayer entered the ears of the family Baal, he began to wish that he had not sent him away. The desire to see him grew a longing. His need of him became imperative. Arthur, who now tried a little to do the work he had before declined, was the poorest substitute for Richard, and his father kept thinking how differently Richard had served him. He repented at last as much as was possible to him, and wished he had left the rascal to take his own way. He tried to understand how it was that, anxious always to please him, he yet would not in such a trifle, and that with nothing to gain and everything to lose by his obstinacy. There might be conscience in it. His mother certainly had a conscience. But how could the fool make the Mansons a matter of his conscience? They were no business of his. He pretended to himself that he had been born without a conscience. At the same time he knew very well that there were pigeonholes in his memory he preferred not searching in, knew very well he had done things which were wrong, things he knew to be wrong when he did them. If he had ever done a thing because he ought to do it, if he had ever abstained from doing a thing because he ought not to do it, he would have known he had a conscience. Because he did not obey his conscience, he would rather believe himself without one. I doubt if consciousness ever exists without conscience, however poorly either may be developed. For the first time in his life, he was possessed with a good longing, namely, for his son. A fulcrum was at length established which might support leverage for his uplifting. He grew visibly greyer, stooped more, and became very irritable. 20 times a day he would be on the point of sending for Richard, but 20 times a day his pride checked him. If the rascal would make but apology enough to satisfy a Frenchman, I would take him back, he would say to himself over and over. But he's such a chip of the old block, so damned independent. Well, I don't call it a great fault. If I had had a trade, I should have been just as independent of my father. No, I want no apology from him. Let him just say, "Mayn't I come back, father? And the gold ring and the wedding garment shall be out for him directly." A month after Richard's expulsion, the baronet drove to the smithy and accused Simon of causing all the mischief. He must send the boy Manson away, he said. He would settle an annuity on the beggar. That done, Richard must make a suitable apology, and he would take him back. Simon listened without a word. He wanted to see how far he would go. "If you will not oblige me," he ended, "you shall not have another stroke of work from Mortgrange, and I will use my influence to drive you from the county." Without waiting for an answer, he turned to walk from the shop. But he did not walk. The moment he turned, Simon took him by the shoulders and ran him right out of the smithy, up to his carriage, into which, for the footman had made haste to open the door, he would have tumbled him neck and heels, but that, gout and all, Sir Wilton managed to spring on the step and get in without falling. In a rage by no means unnatural, he called to the coachman to send his lash about the ruffian's ears. Simon burst into a guffaw, which so startled the horses that the footman had to run to their heads. In his haste to do so, he failed to shut the door properly. It opened and banged, swinging this way and that, as the horses now reared, now backed, now pulled, and the baronet, cursing and swearing, was tossed about in his carriage like a dried-up kernel in a nut. Simon at length, with tears of merriment running down his red cheeks, managed, in a succession of gymnastics, to close the door. "Home, Peterkin!" he shouted, and turning away, strode back to his forge, whence immediately sprang upon the air the merriest tune ever played by anvil and hammer with a horseshoe between them, the sparks flying about the musician like a nimbus of embodied notes. It seemed to soothe the horses, for they started immediately without further racket. Before the next month was over, the baronet was again in the smithy, in a better mood this time. He made no reference to his former ignominious dismissal, wanted only to know if Simon had heard from his grandson. The old man answered that he had. He was well, happy, and busy. Sir Wilton gave a grunt. "Why didn't he stay and help you?" "I begged him to do so," answered Simon, "for he is almost as good at the anvil and quite as good at the shoring as myself. But he said it would annoy his father to have him so near, and he wouldn't do it." His boy's goodwill made the baronet fidget and swear to hide his compunction, but his evil angel got the upper hand. "The rascal knew," he cried, "that nothing would annoy me so much as to have him go back to his mire like the washed sow." Perceiving Simon looked dangerous, he turned with a hasty good morning and made for his carriage, casting more than one uneasy glance over his shoulder. But the blacksmith let him depart in peace. End of chapter 63. Chapter 64 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 64. The Baronet's Funeral. It was about a year after Richard's return to his trade, when one morning the doctor at Barset was roused by a groom, his horse all speckled with foam, who, as soon as he had given his message, galloped to the post office and telegraphed for a well-known London physician. A little later, Richard received a telegram. "Father paralysed. Will meet first train. Wingfold." With sad heart he obeyed the summons and found Wingfold at the station. "I have just come from the house," he said. "He is still insensible. They tell me he came to himself once, just a little, and murmured, 'Richard,' but has not spoken since." "Let us go to him," said Richard. "I fear they will try to prevent you from seeing him." "They shall not find it easy. I have a trap outside. Come along." They reached Mort Grange and stopped at the lodge. Richard walked up to the door. "How is my father?" he asked. "Much the same, sir, I believe." "Is it true that he wanted to see me?" "I don't know, sir." "Is he in his own room?" "Yes, sir, but—" "I beg your pardon, sir," said the man. "I have my lady's orders to admit no one." While he spoke, Richard passed him and went straight to his father's room, which was on the ground floor. He opened the door softly and entered. His father lay on the bed, with the Barset surgeon and the London doctor standing over him. The latter looked round, saw him, and came to him. "I gave orders that no one should be admitted," he said, in a low, stern tone. "I understand my father wished to see me," answered Richard. "He cannot see you." "He may come to himself any moment." He will never come to himself, returned the doctor. Then why keep me out? Said Richard. The eyes of the dying man opened, and Richard received his last look. Sir Wilton gave one sigh, and death was past. Whether life was come, God only, and those who watched on the other side, knew. Lady Anne came in. The good baronet is gone, said the physician. She turned away. Her eyes glided over Richard as if she had never before seen him. He went up to the bed, and she walked from the room. When Richard came out, he found Wingfold where he had left him, and got into the pony carriage beside him. The parson drove off. His tale is told, said Richard in a choking voice. He did not speak, and I cannot tell whether he knew me, but I had his last look, and that is something. I would have been a good son to him if he had let me. At least I would have tried to be. He sat silent, thinking what he might have done for him. Perhaps he would not have died if he had been with him, he thought. It is best, said Wingfold. We cannot say anything would be best, but we must say everything is best. I think I understand you, said Richard, but oh, how I would have loved him if he would have let me. And how you will love him, said Wingfold, for he will love you. They are getting him ready to let you now. I think he is loving you in the darkness. He had begun to love you long before he went, but he was the slave of the nature he had enfeebled and corrupted. I hope endlessly for him, though God only knows how long it may take, even after the change is begun, to bring men like him back to their true selves. But surely, Richard, he cried, bethinking himself, and pulling up his ponies, your right place is at Mortgrange, at least so long as what is left of your father is lying in the house. Yes, no doubt and I did think whether I ought not to assert myself, and remain until my father's will was read, but I concluded it better to avoid the possibility of anything unpleasant. I cannot, of course, yield my right to be chief mourner. I think my father would not wish me to do so. I am sure he would not. Then, till the funeral, you will stay with us, concluded the parson as he drove on. No, I thank you, answered Richard. I must be at my grandfather's. I will go there when I have seen Barbara. On the day of the funeral, no one disputed Richard's right to the place he took, and when it was over, he joined the company assembled to hear the late baronet's will. It was dated 10 years before, and gave the 2 estates of Mortgrange and Cinqmere to his son, Arthur Lestrange. There was in it no allusion to the possible existence of a son by his first wife. Richard rose. The lawyer rose also. I am sorry, Sir Richard, he said, that we can find no later will. There ought to have been some provision for the support of the title. My father died suddenly, answered Richard, and did not know of my existence until about 5 years ago. All I can say is I am very sorry. Do not let it trouble you, returned Richard. It matters little to me. I am independent. I am very glad to hear it. I had imagined it otherwise. A man with a good trade and a good education must be independent. Ah, I understand. But your brother will, as a matter of course, I shall talk to him about it. The estate is quite equal to it. The estate shall not be burdened with me, said Richard with a smile. I am the only one of the family able to do as he pleases. But the title, Sir Richard? The title must look after itself. If I thought it in the smallest degree dependent on money for its dignity, I would throw it into the dirt. If it means anything, it means more than money, and can stand without it. If it be an honour, please God, I shall keep it honourable. Whether I shall set it over my shop remains to be considered. Good morning. As he left the room, a servant met him with the message that Lady Anne wished to see him in the library. Cold as ever, but not colder than always, she poked her long white hand at him. This is awkward for you, Richard, she said, but more awkward still for Arthur. Mortgrange is at your service until you find some employment befitting your position. You must not forget what is due to the family. It is a great pity you offended your father." Richard was silent. "He left it therefore in my hands to do as I thought fit. Sir Wilton did not die the rich man people imagined him, but I am ready to place £1,000 at your disposal." "I should be sorry to make the little he has left you so much less," answered Richard. "As you please," returned her ladyship. "I should like to have just a word with my sister Theodora," said Richard. "I doubt if she will see you. Miss Maliver, will you take Mr. Tuke to the schoolroom, and then inquire whether Miss Lestrange is able to leave her room? You will stay with her. She is far from well. Perhaps you had better go and inquire first. Mr. Tuke will wait you here." Miss Maliver came from somewhere and left the room. Richard felt very angry. Was he not to see his father's daughter except in the presence of that woman? But he said nothing. "There is just one thing," resumed her ladyship, "upon which, if only out of respect to the feelings of my late husband, I feel bound to insist. It is that, while in this neighbourhood, you will be careful as to what company you show yourself in. You will not, I trust, pretend ignorance of my meaning, and cause me the pain of having to be more explicit." Richard was struck dumb with indignation, and remained dumb from the feeling that he could not condescend to answer her as she deserved. Ere he had half recovered himself, she had again resumed. "If the title was ceded to the property," she said, as if talking to herself, "it might be a matter for more material consideration." "Did your ladyship address me?" said Richard. "If you choose to understand what I mean, but I speak with too much delicacy, I fear. Compensation it could be only by courtesy. Suppose I referred to the Court of Chancery my grave doubts of your story?" "My father has acknowledged me." "And repudiated, sent you from the house, left you to pursue your trade, bequeathed you nothing. Everybody knows your father, my late husband, I mean, would risk anything for my annoyance, though, thank God, he dared not attempt to push injury beyond the grave. He well knew the danger of that. Had he really believed you his son, do you imagine he would have left you penniless? Would he not have been rejoiced to put you over Mr. Lestrange's head, if only to wring the heart of his mother? The proofs that satisfied him remain. The testimony, that is, of those most interested in the result, whose very case is a confession of felony. A confession, if you will, that my own aunt was the nurse that carried me away, of which there are proofs." "Has anyone seen those proofs?" "My father has seen them, Lady Anne." "You mean Sir Wilton?" "I do. He accepted them." "Has he left any document to that effect?" "Not that I know of." "Who presented those proofs, as you call them?" "I told Sir Wilton where they had been hidden, and together we found them." "Where?" "In the room that was the nursery." "Which you occupied for months while working at your trade in the house, and for weeks again before Sir Wilton dismissed you?" "Yes," answered Richard, who saw very well what she was driving at, but would not seem to understand before she had fully disclosed her intent. "And where you had opportunity to place what you chose at your leisure? Excuse me! I am only laying before you what counsel would lay before the court." "You wish me to understand, I suppose, that you regard me as an impostor, and believe I put the things, for support of my aunt's evidence, where my father and I found them?" "I do not say so. I merely endeavour to make you see how the court would regard the affair, how much appearance would be against you. At the same time, I confess I have all along had grave doubts of the story. You, of course, may have been deceived as well as your father, I mean the late baronet, my husband, but in any case, I will not admit you to be what you call yourself, until you are declared such by the law of the land. I will, however, make a proposal to you, and no ungenerous one. Pledge yourself to make no defence, if, for form's sake, legal proceedings should be judged desirable, and in lieu of the possible baronetcy, for I admit the bare possibility of the case, if tried, be given against us, I will pay you £5,000. It would cost us less to try the case, no doubt, but the thing would at best be disagreeable. Understand, I do not speak without advice. Plainly you do not, assented Richard. But, he continued, let me place one thing before your ladyship. To do as you asked me would be to endorse your charge against my father, that he acknowledged me. That is, he lied, to give you annoyance. That is enough. But I have the same objection in respect of my uncle and aunt, of whom you propose to make liars and conspirators. He turned to the door. You will consider it, said her ladyship in her stateliest yet softest tone. I will. I shall continue to consider it the worst insult you could have offered my father, your late husband. Thank God he was my mother's husband first. What am I to understand by that? Whatever your ladyship chooses, except that I will not hold any farther communication with you on the matter. Then you mean to dispute the title? I decline to say what I mean or do not mean to do. Lady Anne rose to ring the bell. Miss Maliver met Richard in the doorway. He turned. I am going to bid Theodora good-bye, he said. You shall do no such thing, cried her ladyship. Richard flew up the stair, and believing Miss Maliver had not gone to his sister, went straight to her room. The moment Theodora saw him, she sprang from the bed where she had lain weeping, and threw herself into his arms. He was the only one who had ever made her feel what a man might be to a woman. He told her he had come to bid her good-bye. She looked wild. But you're not going really? For altogether? She said. My dear sister, what else can I do? Nobody here wants me. Indeed, Richard, I do. I know you do, and the time will come when you shall have me, but you would not have me live where I am not loved. Richard, she cried with a burst of indignation, the first, I fancy, she had ever felt, or at least given way to. You're the only gentleman in the family. Richard laughed, and Theodora dried her eyes. Miss Maliver was near enough to be able to report, and the poor girl had a bad time of it in consequence. I will not trouble Arthur, said Richard. Say good-bye to him for me, and give him my love. Please tell him that, although all I had was my father's yet, as between him and me, Miss Brown is mine, and I expect him to send her to Wilder Hall. Good-bye again to my dear sister. I leave a bit of my heart in the house, where I know it will not be trampled on. Theodora could not speak. Her only answer was another embrace, and they parted. Richard went to see Barbara and found her at the parsonage. What an opportunity you have, said Wingfold, of maintaining before the world the honour of work. The man who makes a thing exist that did not exist, or who sets anything right that had gone wrong, must be more worthy than he who only consumes what exists, or helps things to remain wrong. But, suggested Barbara, with her usual keenness, are you not now encouraging him to seek the praise of men? To seek it for a good thing is the more contemptible. There is little praise to be got from men for that, said Wingfold, and I'm sure Richard does not seek any. He would help men to see that the man who serves his neighbour is the man whom the Lord of the universe honours. An idle man, or one busy only for himself, is like a lump of refuse floating this way and that in the flux and reflux of the sewer tide of the world. Were Richard lord of lands, it would be absurd of him to give his life to bookbinding. That would be to desert his neighbour on those lands. But what better can he do now than follow the trade by which he may at once earn his living? To omit the question of possibility, suppose he read for the bar, Would that bring him closer to humanity? Would it be a diviner mode of life? Is it a more honourable thing to win a cause, perhaps for the wrong man, than to preserve an old and valuable book? Will a man rank higher in the kingdom that shall not end, because he has again and again rendered unrighteousness triumphant? Would Richard's mind be as free in chambers as in the workshop to seek into truth, or as keen to suspect its covert? Would he sit closer to the well-springs of thought and aspiration in a barrister's library than among the books by which he wins his bread? With eternity before them, and God at the head and the heart of the universe, Richard and Barbara did not believe in separation any more than in death. He in London, and she at Wilder Hall, they were far more together than most unparted pairs. Wingfold set himself to keep Barbara busy, giving her plenty to read and plenty of work. Her waiting should be no loss of time to her if he could help it. Among other things, he set her to teach his boy where she thought herself much too ignorant. He held not only that to teach is the best way to learn, but the imperfect are the best teachers of the imperfect. He thought this must be why the Lord seems to regard with so much indifference the many falsehoods uttered of and for him. When a man, he said, agonized to get into other hearts the thing dear to his own, the false intellectual or even moral forms in which his ignorance and the crudity of his understanding compelled him to embody it, would not render its truth of none effect, but might, on the contrary, make its reception possible where a truer presentation would stick fast in the doorway. He made Richard promise to take no important step for a year without first letting him know. He was anxious he should have nothing to undo because of what the packet committed to his care might contain. End of chapter 64. Chapter 65 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 65. The Packet. The day so often in Wingfold's thought arrived at last, the anniversary of the death of Sir Wilton. He rose early, his mind anxious, and his heart troubled that his mind should be anxious, and set out for London by the first train. Arrived, he sought at once the office of Sir Wilton's lawyer, and when at last Mr. Bell appeared, begged him to witness the opening of the packet. Mr. Bell broke the seal himself, read the baronet's statement of the request he had made to Wingfold, and then opened the enclosed packet. "A most irregular proceeding," he exclaimed, as well he might. His late client had committed to the keeping of the clergyman of another parish the will signed and properly witnessed, which Mr. Bell had last drawn up for him, and of which, as it was nowhere discoverable, he had not doubted the destruction. Here it was, devising and bequeathing his whole property, real and personal, exclusive only of certain legacies of small account, to Richard L'Estrange, formerly known as Richard Tuke, reputed son of John and Jane Tuke, born Armor, but in reality sole son of Wilton Arthur L'Estrange of Mortgrange and Cinquemere, Baronet, and Robina Armor his wife, daughter of Simon Armor, blacksmith, born in lawful wedlock in the house of Mortgrange in the year 18 , and so worded, at the request of Sir Wilton, that even should the law declare him superstitious, the property must yet be his. "This will be a terrible blow to that proud woman," said Mr. Bell. "You must prepare her for the shock." "Prepare Lady Anne?" exclaimed Wingfold. "Believe me, she is in no danger. An earthquake would not move her." "I must see her lawyer at once," said Mr. Bell, rising. "Let me have the papers, please," said Wingfold. "Sir Wilton did not tell me to bring them to you. I must take them to Sir Richard." "Then you do not wish me to move in the matter?" "I shall advise Sir Richard to put the affair in your hands, but he must do it. I have not the power." "You're very right. I shall be here till 5 o'clock." "I hope to be with you long before that." It took Wingfold an hour to find Richard. He heard the news without a word, but his eyes flashed, and Wingfold knew he thought of Barbara and his mother and the Mansons. Then his face clouded. "It will bring trouble on the rest of my father's family," he said. "Not upon all of them," returned Wingfold, "and you have it in your power to temper the trouble. But I beg you will not be hastily generous, and do what you may regret, finding it for the good of none." "I will think well before I do anything," answered Richard. "But there may be another will yet." "Of course there may. No one can tell. In the meantime we must be guided by appearances. Come with me to Mr. Bell." "I must see my mother first." He found her ironing a shirt for him and told her the news. She received them quietly. So many changes had got both her and Richard into a sober way of expecting. They went to Mr. Bell, and Richard begged him to do what he judged necessary. Mr. Bell at once communicated with Lady Anne's lawyer, and requested him to inform her ladyship that Sir Richard would call upon her the next day. Mr. Wingfold accompanied him to Mortgrange. Lady Anne received them with perfect coolness. "You are, I trust, aware of the cause of my visit, Lady Anne?" said Richard. "I am." "May I ask what you propose to do?" "That, excuse me, is my affair. It lies with me to ask you what provision you intend making for Sir Wilton's family." "Allow me, Lady Anne, to take the lesson you have given me, and answer, 'That is my affair.'" She saw that she had made a mistake. "For my part," she returned, "I should not object to remaining in the house, were I but assured that my daughters should be in no danger of meeting improper persons." "It would be no pleasure, Lady Anne, to either of us to be so near the other. Our ways of thinking are too much opposed. I venture to suggest that you should occupy your jointure house." "I will do as I see fit." "You must find another home." Lady Anne left the room, and the next week the house, betaking herself to her own, which was not far off, in the park at Cinquemere, the smaller of the two estates. The week following, Richard went to see Arthur. "Now, Arthur," he said, "let us be frank with each other. I am not your enemy. I am bound to do the best I can for you all. When you thought the land was yours, I had a trade to fall back upon. Now that the land proves mine, you have no trade or other means of making a livelihood. If you will be a brother, you will accept what I offer. I will make over to you for your lifetime, but without power to devise it, this estate of Cinquemere, burdened with the payment of 500 a year to your sister Theodora until her marriage." Arthur was glad of the gift, yet did not accept it graciously. The disposition is no rare one that not only gives grudgingly, but receives grudgingly. The man imagines he shields his independence by not seeming pleased. To show yourself pleased is to confess obligation. Do not manifest pleasure, do not acknowledge favour, and you keep your freedom like a man. "I cannot see," said Arthur. "Of course it is very kind of you and all that. You wouldn't have compliments bandied between brothers, but I should like to know why the land should not be mine to leave. I might have children, you know." "And I might have more children," laughed Richard, "but that has nothing to do with it. The thing is this. The land itself I could give out and out, but the land has the people. God did not give us the land for our own sakes only, but for theirs too. The men and women upon it are my brothers and sisters, and I have to see to them. Now I know that you are liked by our people, and that you have claims to be liked by them, and therefore believe you will consider them as well as yourself on the land, though at the same time I shall protect them with the terms of the deed. But suppose at your death it should go to Percy. Should I not then feel that I had betrayed my people, a very Judas of landlords? Never fellow creature of mine will I put in the danger of a scoundrel like him. He is my brother. And mine, I know him. I was at Oxford with him. Not one foothold shall he ever have on land of mine. When he wants to work, let him come to me. Not till then. You will not say that to my mother? I will say nothing to your mother. Do you accept my offer? I will think it over. Do, said Richard, and turned to go. Will you not settle something on Victoria? Said Arthur. We shall see what she turns out by the time she is of age. I don't want to waste money. What do you mean by wasting money? Giving it where it will do no good. God gives to the bad as well as the good. It is one thing to give to the bad, and another to give where it will do no good. God knows the endless result. I should know but the first link of its chain. I must act by the knowledge granted me. God may give money in punishment. Should I dare do that? Well, you're quite beyond me. Never mind then. What you and I have to do is to be friends and work together. You will find I mean well. I believe you do, Richard, but we don't somehow seem to be in the same world. If we are true, that will not keep us apart. If we both work for the good of the people, we must come together. To tell you the truth, Richard, knowing you had given me the land, I could not put up with interference. I am afraid we should quarrel, and then I should seem ungrateful. What would you say to our managing the estates together for a year or two? Would not that be the way to understand each other? Perhaps. I must think about it. That is right. Only don't let us begin with suspicion. You did me more than one kindness not knowing I was your brother, and you sent back Miss Brown. That was mere honesty. Strictly considered, it was more. My father had a right to take the mare from me, and at his death she came into your possession. I thank you for sending her to Barbara. Arthur turned away. My dear fellow, said Richard, Barbara loved me when I was a bookbinder, and promised to marry me thinking me base-born. I am sorry, but there is no blame to either of us. I had my bad time then, and your good time is, I trust, coming. I did nothing to bring about the change. I did think once whether I had not better leave all to you and keep to my trade. But I saw that I had no right to do so, because duties attended the property which I was better able for than you. I believe every word you say, Richard. You are nobler than I. End of chapter 65.
Chapter 66 of There and Back. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. There and Back by George MacDonald. Chapter 66. Barbara's Dream. Mr. Wilder could not well object to Sir Richard Lestrange on the ground that his daughter had loved him before she or her father knew his position the same he was coveting for her. And within 2 months they were married. Lady Anne was invited, but did not go to the wedding. Arthur, Theodora, and Victoria did. Percy was not invited. Neither bride nor bridegroom seeing any sense in setting out on a journey the moment they were free to be at home together, they went straight from the church to Mortgrange. When they entered the hall which had so moved Richard's admiration the first time he saw it, he stood for a moment lost in thought. When he came to himself, Barbara had left him. But ere he had time to wonder, such a burst of organ music filled the place as might have welcomed one that had overcome the world. He stood entranced for a minute, then hastened to the gallery, where he found Barbara at the instrument. "What!" he cried in astonishment.
You, Barbara, you play like that. I wanted to be worth something to you, Richard. Oh, Barbara, you are a queen at giving. I was well named, for you were coming. I am Richard indeed, oh, so rich. In the evening they went out into the park. The moon was rising. The sunlight was not quite gone. Her light mingled with the light that gave it her. Do you know that lovely passage in the book of Baruch? Asked Richard. What book is that? Returned Barbara. It can't be in the Bible, surely. It is in the Apocrypha, which is to me very much in the Bible. I think I can repeat it. I haven't a good memory, but some things stick fast. But in the process of recalling it, Richard's thoughts wandered, and Baruch was forgotten. This dying of Apollo in the arms of Luna, he said, this melting of the radiant god into his own pale shadow, always reminds me of the poverty-stricken, wasted and sad, yet lovely Elysium of the pagans. So little consolation did they gather from the thought of it, that they longed to lay their bodies, not in the deep, cool, far-off shadow of grove or cave, but by the ringing roadside, where live feet in two meeting, mingling, parting tides ever came and went, where chariots rushed past in hot haste, or moved stately by in jubilant procession, where at night lonely forms would steal through the city of the silent, with but the moon to see them go, bent on ghastly conference with witch or enchanter. And where are you going, Richard? Please take me with you. I feel as if I were lost in a wood. What I meant to say, replied Richard with a little laugh, was how different the moonlit shadowland of those people from the sunny realm of the radiant Christ. Jesus rose again because he was true, and death had no part in him. This world's day is but the moonlight of his world. The shadow man, who knows neither whence he came nor whither he is going, calls the upper world the house of the dead, being himself a ghost that wanders in its caves, and knows neither the blowing of its wind, the dashing of its waters, the shining of its sun, nor the glad laughter of its inhabitants. They wandered along, now talking, now silent, their two hearts lying together in a great peace. The moon kept rising and brightening, slowly victorious over the pallid light of the dead sun, till at last she lifted herself out of the vaporous horizon sea, ascended over the tree-tops, and went walking through the unobstructed sky, mistress of the air, queen of the heavens, lady of the eyes of men. Yet was she lady only because she beheld her Lord. She saw the light of her light, and told what she saw of him. When the soul of man sees God, it shines, said Richard. They reached at length the spot where first they met in the moonlight. With one heart they stopped and turned, and looked each in the other's moonlit eyes. Barbara spoke first. Now, she said, tell me what Baruch says. Ah, yes, Baruch. He was the prophet Jeremiah's friend, an amanuensis. It was the moon made me think of him. I believe I can give you the passage word for word, as it stands in the English Bible. But he that knoweth all things knoweth her, that is wisdom, and hath found her out with his understanding. He that prepared the earth for evermore hath filled it with four-footed beasts. He that sendeth forth light, and it goeth, calleth it again, and it obeyeth him with fear. The stars shined in their watches, and rejoiced. When he calleth them, they say, Here we be. And so with cheerfulness they showed light unto him that made them. This is our God, and there shall none other be accounted of in comparison of him. That is beautiful, cried Barbara. They said, Here we be, and so, what is it? And so with cheerfulness they showed light unto him that made them. I will read every word of Baruch, said Barbara. Is there much of him? No, very little. A silence followed. Then again Barbara spoke, and she clung a little closer to her husband. I want to tell you something that came to me one night when we were in London, she said. It was a miserable time that, before I found you up in the orchestra there, and then hell became purgatory for there was hope in it. I saw so many miserable things. I seemed always to come upon the miserable things. It was as if my eyes were made only to see miserable things, bad things and suffering everywhere, The terrible city was full of them. I longed to help, but had to wait for you to set me free. You had gone from my knowledge, and I was very sad, seeing nothing around me but a waste of dreariness. I kept asking God to give me patience, and not let me fancy myself alone. But the days were dismal, and the balls and dinners frightful. I seemed in a world without air. The girls were so silly, the men so inane, and the things they said so mawkish and colourless. Their compliments sickened me so that I was just hungry to hide myself. But at last came what I want to tell you. One morning, after what seemed a long night's dreamless sleep, I awoke, but it was much too early to rise. So I lay thinking, or more truly, I hope, being thought into, as Mr. Wingfold says. Many of the most beautiful things I had read, scenes of our Lord's life on earth, and thoughts of the Father, came and went. I had no desire to sleep again, or any feeling of drowsiness, but in the midst of fully conscious thought, found myself in some other place, of which I only knew that there was firm ground under my feet, and a soft white radiance of light about me. The remembrance came to me afterwards of branches of trees spreading high overhead, through which I saw the sky. But at the time I seemed not to take notice of what was around me. I was leaning against a form tall and grand, clothed from the shoulders to the ground in a black robe, full and soft and fine. It lay in thickly gathered folds, touched to whiteness in the radiant light, all along the arms encircling, without at first touching me. With sweet content, my eyes went in and out of those manifold radiant lines, feeling, though they were but parts of his dress, yet they were of himself, for I knew the form to be that of the Heavenly Father, but felt no trembling fear, no sense of painful awe, only a deep, deep worshipping, an unutterable love and confidence. "Oh, Father," I said, not aloud, but low into the folds of his garment. Scarcely had I breathed the words when, "My child," came whispered, and I knew his head was bent toward me, and I felt his arms close round my shoulders and the folds of his garment enwrap me, and with a soft sweep fall behind me to the ground. Delight held me still for a while, and then I looked up to see his face, but I could not see past his breast. His shoulders rose far above my upreaching hands. I clasped them together, and face and hands rested near his heart, for my head came not much above his waist. And now came the most wonderful part of my dream. As I thus rested against his heart, I seemed to see into it, and mine was filled with loving wonder and an utterly blessed feeling of home to the very core. I was at home with my Father. I looked, as it seemed, into a space illimitable and fathomless, and yet a warm light as from a hearth-fire shone and played in ruddy glow, as upon confining walls. And I saw there gathered all human hearts. I saw them, yet I saw no forms. They were there, and yet they would be there. To my waking reason the words sound like nonsense, and perplex me, but the thing did not perplex me at all. With light beyond that of faith, for it was of absolute certainty, clear as bodily vision, but of a different nature, I saw them. But this part of my dream, the most lovely of all, I can find no words to describe, nor can I even recall to my own mind the half of what I felt. I only know that something was given me then, some spiritual apprehension, to be again withdrawn, but to be given to us all, I believe, some day, out of his infinite love, and withdrawn no more. Every heart that had ever ached or longed or wondered I knew was there, folded warm and soft, safe and glad. And it seemed in my dream that to know this was the crown of all my bliss. Yes, even more than to be myself in my Father's arms. Awake, the thought of multitude had always oppressed my mind. It did not then. From the comfort and joy it gave me to see them there, I seemed then first to know how my own heart had ached for them. Then tears began to run from my eyes, but easily, with no pain of the world in them. They flowed like a gentle stream into the heart of God, whose depths were open to my gaze. The blessedness of those tears was beyond words. It was all true then. That heart was our home. Then I felt that I was being gently, oh, so gently, put away. The folds of his robe which I held in my hands were being slowly drawn from them, and the gladness of my weeping changed to longing entreaty. "Oh, father, father," I cried, but I saw only his grand, gracious form, all blurred and indistinct through the veil of my blinding tears, slowly receding, slowly fading, and I awoke. My tears were flowing now with the old earth pain in them, with keenest disappointment and longing. To have been there, and to have come back, was the misery. But it did not last long. The glad thought awoke that I had the dream, a precious thing never to be lost while memory lasted, a thing which nothing but its realization could ever equal in preciousness. I rose glad and strong, to serve with newer love, with quicker hand and readier foot, the hearts around me. End of chapter 66. End of There and Back by George MacDonald.